Summer sun lay heavy on the porch at Winter Ridge. An old man sat in his chair carved from pine 60 years before, watching the valley stretch below him in waves of green and shadow. Caleb Winters was 98 years old. His hands were gnarled like ancient roots, spotted with age but steady still. The mountains had taught him steadiness. Beside him, his great-grandson shafted in the wicker chair, young and nervous, in the way young men get when big decisions press against them. Thomas was 20, fresh from college, and the letter in his pocket felt heavy as stone. Orders to report. The world was still tense even after Korea, and young men still got called to serve. Caleb watched the boy try not to fidget. He remembered that feeling. The weight of choosing when you did not yet know how to choose. Thomas finally broke the silence. His voice came quiet, uncertain. How did you know? When everything was unclear, how did you know you were making the right choice? The old man did not answer right away. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a silver ring, worn smooth by decades. Engraved letters caught the light. GM 1885. Let me tell you about the woman who saved my life 3 times before I realized I loved her, Caleb said. His voice was rough but clear, stronger than his body should allow. And about the mountain we almost lost to one woman's greed. Thomas leaned forward. His grandfather had never spoken much about the past. Now, with death close enough to smell, the old man seemed ready to unburden himself. Your great-grandmother, Grace. Caleb nodded slowly, his eyes distant, seeing across 70 years. Grace Morgan, the poorest girl I ever met, and the smartest. The valley below them hummed with life. 100 families lived there, now in houses scattered along the creek and up the slopes. Children's voices carried on the wind. Somewhere a hammer rang against wood. The community had grown from nothing, from one hard choice made in desperation. This is her story, Caleb said, and mine. Listen close, boy. You'll need it soon enough. The old man closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of remembering. He was no longer 98 and dying. He was 28 and alive, with need and fear and hope. He was riding down from the high country with a plan that seemed half mad, and the year was 1885. Pine Ridge huddled at the base of the mountains like something trying not to be noticed. It was a small town, the kind that grew up around need rather than ambition. Miners came down from the claims for supplies. Ranchers drove cattle through on the way to Denver. The town took their money and asked few questions. Behind a cabin at the edge of Pine Ridge, Grace Morgan worked in her father's garden. Late spring had finally gentled the ground enough to plant, but the soil was still cold and mean. She pulled weeds with practiced efficiency, her movements quick and sure. 22 years old, auburn hair, pulled back in a simple braid, hands already rough from work. The garden was small. Everything about their life was small now. Inside the cabin, her father's medical instruments hung on the wall above an empty desk. Dr. William Morgan had been dead for 3 months. Pneumonia had taken him fast, which was a mercy, though it left his children with nothing but debts and questions about what came next. Grace straightened, pressing one hand to the small of her back. Through the window, she could see her brother Daniel splitting wood, his thin shoulders struggling with the axe. 16 years old and trying to be a man before his time. Their sister Emily sat on the porch step, mending a shirt with needle and thread, her small fingers careful with each stitch. 12 years old, and already she knew how to make things last. They were holding together, barely. Grace went inside and washed her hands in the basin, scrubbing the dirt from under her nails. The cabin felt empty without her father's presence. His books still lined the shelf. His stethoscope hung from a nail. But the man himself was gone, buried in the cemetery on the hill, and with him went any hope of stability. A knock came at the door, not tentative, not apologetic, firm and expecting. Grace dried her hands and opened the door to find Jacob, one of the miners from up the creek. He stood on the porch with his left hand wrapped in a filthy rag, blood seeping through. Miss Grace, he said, his voice tight with pain, caught it on a saw blade. Figured you might help, seeing as your father taught you. Grace stepped back and gestured him inside. Sit at the table, let me see it. She had learned medicine the way some children learn to read, sitting beside her father, while he worked, watching his hands, listening to his explanations. By the time she was 15, she could set a bone and stitch a wound. By 20, she could diagnose most of what walked through the door. She unwrapped Jacob's hand carefully. The gash ran deep across his palm, still bleeding dirt. Or Demer already working into it. This needs cleaning first, then stitches. Jacob nodded, his jaw tight. Can't pay right now. Mine's been slow. Grace did not look up from his hand. She poured whiskey over the wound, watching him flinch. Pay when you can, or bring meat if you get a deer. We'll manage. She threaded the needle, her movements practiced and calm. The first stitch went through skin, and Jacob hissed between his teeth. Grace worked steadily, her voice low and instructive, the way her father's had been. Keep it clean. Wash it twice a day with soap and hot water. If you see red streaks going up your arm, come back immediately. That means infection spreading. She tied off the last stitch and wrapped his hand in clean cloth. From her father's dwindling medical supplies, she pulled out dried herbs, yarrow for bleeding, comfrey for healing. She put them in a small cloth bag and pressed it into his good hand. Steep this in hot water. Drink it twice a day. It helps fight infection. Jacob stood cradling his bandaged hand. You're good as your father was, Miss Grace. Maybe better. After he left, Grace counted the coins in the tin box on the shelf. $12. That was all that stood between them and complete ruin. She had already sold the horse, the good furniture, anything that might bring money. What remained was the cabin itself, the medical tools, and the crushing weight of her father's debts. $2,000 owed to Mr. Thornton, the banker from Denver. The letter sat on the table, creased from reading. 2 weeks to pay or the cabin would be seized. The claim, the land, everything. Grace sat at her father's desk and opened his journal to the last page. His handwriting, familiar and steady, looked back at her. She ran her finger over the words he had written a week before he died. Grace, you have healing hands. Do not let poverty bury that gift. She closed the book and pressed her palms against her eyes. Crying would not pay debts. Crying would not feed Daniel and Emily. She stood and went to start supper because that at least was something she could do. That night, after Daniel and Emily had gone to sleep in the loft, Grace sat alone by the dying fire. The weight of responsibility pressed against her chest like a physical thing. She was not afraid of hard work. She was not afraid of sacrifice. But she was afraid of failing the two people who depended on her completely. She did not know that on a ridge above the town, a man sat on his horse in the darkness, watching smoke rise from her chimney. She did not know he had been watching for 2 weeks, studying her movements, measuring her character in the way she bargained at the store and treated patients who could not pay, and spoke to her siblings with patience, even when exhaustion made her voice shake. Caleb Walker sat in his saddle and made his decision. She was the one. She had to be. He had no more time to search, no more room for doubt. The deadline pressed close, and he needed a wife, but more than that, he needed someone who would understand what he was really asking. He turned his horse toward the high country and rode back to his solitary camp. In 3 days, he would make his offer. She would accept or refuse, but either way, the asking could not wait. 3 days later, wind rattled the shutters as evening settled over Pine Ridge. Grace had just finished washing the supper dishes when the knock came. This one was different from Jacob's desperate pounding. This knock was steady, deliberate, the sound of someone who expected to be heard. Daniel moved toward the door, but Grace touched his shoulder. Let me. She opened the door and found a man standing in the twilight, tall and broad across the shoulders, wearing worn leather and canvas that marked him as someone who lived rough. His beard was dark, touched with early gray. His eyes were blue and startlingly direct in the fading light. He removed his hat. I need to speak with Miss Grace Morgan. Grace kept one hand on the doorframe. I'm Grace Morgan. My name is Caleb Walker. I have a proposition that might solve your difficulties. The words should have sounded presumptuous, but his tone was matter-of-fact, almost gentle. Grace felt Daniel tense behind her, protective despite his youth. She made a decision and stepped back. Come inside. The cabin's single room felt smaller with Caleb Walker standing in it. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with the kind of presence that came from competence rather than arrogance. He waited until Grace gestured to a chair before sitting, and even then he perched on the edge, hat in his hands. Emily and Daniel watched from the ladder to the loft, their eyes wide. Grace remained standing, her arms crossed. She had learned wariness from her father, who had seen too many desperate people make bad bargains. You said you have a proposition, Grace said. I'm listening. Caleb looked at her steadily. I hold land in the high country. My father passed 5 years ago and left conditions in his will. I must marry before I turn 29 or the estate passes to my cousin. I have 6 weeks. Grace's expression did not change. And you came to me because I need a wife and you need money. I can pay your debts and provide for your family. In exchange, you marry me and come to Winter Ridge. The bluntness should have been offensive. Instead, it felt almost refreshing. No false promises, no pretense of romance, just a transaction laid bare. What exactly are you offering? Grace asked. Caleb's answer came precise and measured, like he had rehearsed it. I will settle your debt with Thornton, $2,000. I will deed 20 acres of good land to your brother when he comes of age and provide for your sister's education. You will have a clinic to practice medicine. Your family will want for nothing. And in return, you become my wife. A real marriage, not a arrangement on paper. You come to Winter Ridge and help build something that lasts. Grace felt her heart beating hard against her ribs. The offer was too good. Nothing this good came without conditions, without hidden costs. Why me? Surely there are women in Denver who would marry you gladly. Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I don't want someone who wants my money. I want someone who understands what it costs to survive. Someone who will value land and community over luxury. You've been watching me, Grace said. It was not a question. He did not deny it. For 2 weeks. I saw you fight for fair wage at Patterson's toy store. I saw you treat that miner for no payment. I saw you teach your siblings after dark even though you were exhausted. You are who I need. The honesty was almost brutal. Grace looked at Daniel and Emily on the ladder. Emily's eyes were bright with hope. Daniel's face showed calculation beyond his years, weighing options they did not have. Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He set it on the table with a soft clink. $50 for your family's needs this week. No strings. You have 3 days to decide. I will return for your answer. He stood, placed his hat back on his head, and moved toward the door. Grace found her voice. Mr. Walker. He turned. If I refuse, what happens to you? His expression was unreadable. I lose the land. My cousin sells it to the railroad. They clear-cut every tree and move on. What I built, these. And if I accept, then we fight to save it together. He left, stepping out into the night. Grace heard his horse's hooves fade into silence. She stood frozen, staring at the leather pouch on the table. Daniel climbed down from the loft and picked it up, opening it carefully. His eyes went wide. Grace, this is more than we make in 4 months. Emily came down, her voice small and hopeful. Does this mean we get to stay? Grace sank into her father's chair. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table and took a long breath. 3 days to decide whether to marry a stranger and leave everything she knew or refuse and watch her family fall apart. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, mind racing through possibilities. She tried to find the trap, the hidden cruelty in Caleb Walker's offer. But the more she turned it over, the more she came back to one simple truth. He had been honest. Brutally, completely honest. He needed a wife to keep his inheritance. She needed money to save her family. Everything else was just details. In the morning, she walked into town. The streets were busy with Saturday commerce. She went to Patterson's store and bought flour, bacon, and coffee with money from Caleb's pouch. Mrs. Patterson watched with barely concealed curiosity. Heard the mountain man came calling last night, she said, her voice sugar-sweet with malice. Offering to buy himself a wife, they say. Grace met her eyes without flinching. They say a lot of things, most of it nonsense, so. But the gossip had already spread. By the time Grace left the store, half the town seemed to know. Old Pete, the miner who had worked the claims for 30 years, stopped her on the wooden sidewalk. Miss Grace, I don't know what that man offered you, but I knew him before he went up the mountain. Caleb Walker's strange, but he's honest. He saved my life in a blizzard 3 years back, carried me down on his own back. Never asked for payment, never spoke of it again. Make of that what you will. Grace thanked him and walked home. The words stayed with her. Honest. That was what Pete said. That was what her own observations suggested. In a world full of men who lied as easily as breathing, maybe honesty was worth something. That evening, Daniel found her in the garden. He sat on the fence rail and watched her work for a long moment before speaking. Are you going to accept? Grace pulled another weed, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. I don't know. If you don't, Thornton takes the cabin in 10 days. They will send Emily and me to the orphanage in Denver or separate us to different families. I've read about those places, Grace. They are not kind. She looked at her brother. When had he grown up? When had he learned to speak with such clear-eyed pragmatism? You think I should accept? I think you are trying to protect us by refusing, and that is noble but foolish. We can survive losing the cabin. We cannot survive you dying of overwork, trying to keep us together without help. Grace felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. He is a stranger, Daniel. I would be marrying someone I do not know, moving to a place I have never seen. But he is honest, Daniel said quietly. That is more than most men offer. And he clearly respects you, or he would not have watched to make certain you were the right choice. That should disturb me more than it does, Grace admitted. Daniel smiled slightly. Maybe, or maybe it means he takes choosing a wife seriously. Father always said character reveals itself in how people make decisions. This man decided carefully. That is not nothing. On the third day, Caleb returned. Grace was ready. She had washed her face, braided her hair, and put on her only good dress. When his knock came, she did not hesitate. She opened the door and looked him in the eye. I accept your offer, but I have conditions. Caleb's expression did not change, but something in his posture eased slightly. Name them. Daniel and Emily stay in Pine Ridge until summer. They finish the school term. After that, they come to Winter Ridge. Agreed. I want a real clinic, not a promise, but actual space and supplies. You will have it. And this marriage, it is real, you said, but I need time to adjust, to know you. I will not be rushed into intimacy. For the first time, Caleb's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. That is fair. We will build trust first. Grace nodded once sharp and decisive. Then I will marry you, Mr. Walker. Caleb, he said, if we are to be married, you should call me Caleb. Grace, she replied, just Grace. They stood on opposite sides of the threshold, two strangers making a bargain that would change everything. Outside, Pine Ridge went about its business unaware and uncaring. But in that small cabin, two lives tilted on the edge of transformation. The wedding can be next Saturday, Caleb said. Simple at the church, then we leave for Winter Ridge. Grace swallowed hard. 1 week, 7 days to prepare to say goodbye, to step off the edge of everything she knew. I will be ready. After he left, Emily came to stand beside her. Are you scared? Grace put her arm around her sister's thin shoulders. Terrified. But I am doing it anyway. That is what brave means, Emily said solemnly. Father told me once, being brave is not the same as not being scared. Grace held her sister close and hoped desperately that her father had been right. Saturday morning came too fast and too slow. Grace woke before dawn in the cabin for the last time as a single woman. She lay in bed and listened to Daniel's quiet breathing from the loft, Emily's small sighs. Soon she would sleep somewhere else beside someone else, and the thought made her stomach twist with anxiety and something she could not quite name. The church was small pine boards weathered gray by mountain winters. Reverend Thompson waited at the front, his kind old face creased with concern and blessing both. He had baptized Grace when she was an infant. He had buried her parents. Now he would marry her to a man he barely knew. Grace wore her brown dress, the one she saved for church and special occasions. It was not a wedding gown. There had been no time, no money, no point in pretending this was a romantic occasion. Caleb wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hair combed back, his beard trimmed. He looked almost civilized, almost like he belonged in town rather than the high wilderness. Daniel and Emily sat in the front pew. A handful of townspeople had come out of curiosity or kindness. Mrs. Patterson sat near the back, her face pinched with judgment. Old Pete sat beside Daniel, his weathered hands folded, his eyes approving. Reverend Thompson opened his prayer book and looked at them both with searching eyes. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly. It is a covenant before God and this community. Do you both understand the weight of what you are about to promise? Grace's voice came steady. I do. Caleb's answer was equally firm. I do. The Reverend nodded and began the ceremony. The words washed over Grace like water familiar from a dozen weddings she had attended. Love, honor, cherish, for better or worse, till death. The promises felt enormous, impossible to keep with someone she barely knew. When it came time for vows, Caleb turned to face her fully. He took her hands in his. His palms were rough-scarred from work, warm and steady. He spoke the words clearly, without hesitation, his eyes never leaving hers. I, Caleb Walker, take you, Grace Morgan, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to stand beside you, to protect what we build together, and to honor your partnership in all things. The words were traditional, but the way he said them felt like something more, like a contract sealed in witness and will. Grace drew a breath and spoke her own vows. I, Grace Morgan, take you, Caleb Walker, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand with you, to bring healing where I can, and to build something worth keeping. She had written the last part herself late at night by candlelight. The Reverend had approved with a small smile. Caleb produced a ring from his pocket, simple silver worn smooth at the edges. He slid it onto her finger and it fit as if made for her, though she knew it could not have been. Later, she would learn it had been his mother's saved for 20 years against this moment. By the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Thompson said. May God bless this union and grant you both wisdom and grace. He did not say to kiss. Caleb did not try. Instead, he squeezed her hands once gently and released them. It felt right, appropriate. They were married now, but still strangers. The physical intimacy would come later, if it came at all. After the ceremony, Emily threw wildflowers gathered from the meadow. They stuck in Grace's hair and dress, tiny bursts of color against brown fabric. Daniel shook Caleb's hand with a gravity beyond his years. Take care of her, Daniel said. Caleb's answer was simple. I will. Saying goodbye nearly broke Grace's composure. Emily clung to her, crying into her dress. Grace knelt and held her sister tight, breathing in the smell of her hair, memorizing the feel of her small body. I will see you in 2 months, Grace whispered. Summer is not so far away. And then you will come to Winter Ridge, and we will all be together. Promise? Emily's voice was muffled against Grace's shoulder. I promise. Daniel did not cry, but his eyes were too bright. Grace embraced him and felt how thin he still was, how young despite his attempts at manhood. Take care of each other. Study hard. I will write every week. We will be fine, Daniel said, but his voice cracked on the last word. The wagon waited in front of the church. Caleb had loaded it the day before with Grace's belongings, her father's medical instruments, her few dresses and books. It was not much, a whole life packed into a few crates and bags. Caleb helped her onto the seat. His hand under her elbow was courteous, impersonal. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. 2 strong horses stood patient in their traces, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. Ready? Caleb asked. Grace looked back at the church at her brother and sister, standing small and brave on the steps. At the town where she had grown up, where her parents were buried, where everything familiar lived. Then she looked ahead toward the mountains rising blue and distant against the sky. Ready, she said. The wagon rolled forward. Pine Ridge fell away behind them. The road climbed steadily into the foothills, and with each turn the town grew smaller, until it was just a scatter of buildings, then a memory, then gone. They rode in silence for the first hour. The only sounds were the creak of wheels, the jingle of harness, the rhythmic clop of hooves on packed dirt. Grace kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape change. Pines grew thicker. The air grew cooler. They were climbing into country she had never seen. Finally, Caleb spoke. There is a canteen of water under the seat, and food in the box behind us if you are hungry. Thank you. More silence. Grace searched for something to say, some way to bridge the enormous gap between them. How far is Winter Ridge? 3 days' travel. We will camp tonight by a creek I know. Tomorrow we climb higher. The 3rd day we arrive. 3 days. It felt both too long and not long enough. Grace pulled her shawl tighter as the temperature dropped. The road narrowed, winding between massive pines that blocked the sun. Shadows gathered thick and cool. Caleb pointed ahead without taking his hands off the reins. See those scratches on that tree trunk, Bear? Big one from the height, marked his territory maybe 2 days ago. Grace looked and saw the long gouges in the bark high above her head. Are there many bears? Some, they avoid people mostly, unless you surprise them or get between a mother and cubs. Then they defend. How do you avoid surprising them? Caleb glanced at her with something that might have been approval. Make noise, talk, sing anything so they hear you coming. And watch for sign, tracks, scat, scratches. The forest tells you everything if you learn to read it. For the next hour he taught her, pointing out broken branches that marked where elk had passed, scat that told what animals moved through and when, the way water flowed and where to find game trails. Grace listened intently, filing away information that might keep her alive in this new world. At midday, they stopped to rest the horses. Caleb showed her how to check their hooves for stones, how to read their body language for signs of strain. Grace watched his hands move with practiced confidence over the animals. Everything he did was efficient, economical, no wasted motion. They ate bread and cheese sitting on a fallen log. The food was simple but good. Caleb had packed well. Grace realized she was ravenous and tried not to eat too quickly, maintaining some shred of dignity. You are not what I expected, she said. Caleb raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? Someone cruder, rougher. You live alone in the mountains. I thought you would be more like the miners, but you are educated. My father insisted on education. Before I went to the mountains, I read law and business. It did not suit me, but I learned. Why did you leave for the mountains? His expression closed slightly. That is a longer story. For another time, perhaps. Grace nodded, accepting the boundary. They were married, but that did not mean she had rights to all his secrets. Not yet, maybe not ever. This was partnership, not romance. They reached the creek as sunset painted the western sky orange and gold. Caleb unhitched the horses and led them to water, while Grace gathered dry wood for a fire. She had camped before on trips with her father to distant patients. The skills came back easily. Caleb built the fire with flint and steel, not wasting matches. The flames caught and grew, pushing back the gathering darkness. He strung canvas from the wagon to create a shelter, working quickly and surely. You sleep there, he said, pointing to the canvas enclosure. I will sleep by the fire. Grace felt relief and something else. Something she could not name. Disappointment, maybe. But that was ridiculous. She barely knew this man. She should be grateful for his respect of her boundaries. They ate beans and bacon, cooked over the fire. The food was plain but satisfying. Night settled, fully bringing stars so thick and bright they looked like spilled salt across black velvet. Grace had never seen so many stars. In town, lamplight dulled them. Out here, they blazed. It is beautiful, she said softly. Caleb looked up from his coffee. Yes, this is why I came to the mountains. Too much beauty to leave it. But you did leave. You came back to Pine Ridge for a wife. His jaw tightened. Circumstances change. Sometimes you have to return to what you left behind. Grace wanted to press to understand what drove him, but exhaustion pulled at her bones. The day had been long and strange and overwhelming. I should sleep. Sleep well, Grace. She crawled into the canvas shelter and wrapped herself in blankets. The ground was hard beneath her, the sounds of the forest, strange and slightly frightening. Owls called. Something rustled in the underbrush. Far away, a coyote howled. But she also heard Caleb moving around the fire, adding wood, settling in for watch. Somehow that sound was comforting. He was keeping guard while she slept. It was not romance, but it was protection. It was care. She drifted into uneasy sleep and did not dream. The second day brought harder terrain. The road climbed steeply, switchbacking up the mountainside. The horses labored in their harness muscles, bunching under their hide. Caleb walked beside them on the steep sections, easing their burden, talking to them in a low, steady voice. Grace watched him and began to understand. This was how he showed care, not through words or grand gestures, but through attention to what was needed. The horses needed help. He helped. It was that simple and that profound. By noon, they had climbed high enough that the air felt thin. Grace found herself breathing hard, her head slightly light. Caleb noticed and stopped to rest. Your body needs time to adjust to the altitude. Drink water. Breathe deep. It will pass. She obeyed, sipping from the canteen, forcing herself to breathe slowly despite the urge to gasp. Gradually, the dizziness faded. Better, Caleb asked. Yes, thank you. They continued. The landscape changed again. Thick pine gave way to aspen groves, their white bark like bones against the mountainside. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows they passed through, purple and yellow and red. What are those? Grace asked, pointing to a cluster of purple blooms. Caleb slowed the wagon. Lupine. And those yellow ones are glacier lilies. Over there, Indian paintbrush. Any of them medicinal? Some, I can show you what I know, but my knowledge is limited, enough to survive, not to heal. Then we learn together, Grace said. I will teach you medicine, and you teach me the forest. Something flickered across Caleb's face. Surprise, maybe, or pleasure? That seems fair. They stopped beside a creek to water the horses. The water ran fast and clear over smooth stones cold enough to make Grace's teeth ache when she dipped her hand in. While the horses drank, Grace explored the creek bank. She found wild mint growing in the shade and what looked like yarrow. She picked some carefully, wrapping it in cloth. Her medical supplies were limited. Supplementing with wild herbs would help. When she turned back, Caleb was watching her. What did you find? She showed him. Mint for digestion, yarrow for bleeding and infection. Both useful. You have your father's eye. He taught me well. Her voice caught slightly on the words. The grief was still fresh, still ready to ambush her at unexpected moments. Caleb looked away, giving her privacy to compose herself. It was a kindness, that looking away, a recognition that some pain needed space. They made camp that night in a high meadow. The sunset was spectacular, the sky turning crimson and gold and purple. Grace stood watching until the last light faded, feeling small under the vast dome of heaven. Caleb came to stand beside her, not touching, just present. Winter Ridge is beyond that pass, he said, pointing to a gap between two peaks. Tomorrow you will see it. Will I like it? The question came out before Grace could stop it. I do not know, Caleb said honestly. It is isolated, beautiful but hard. Some people find peace there. Others feel trapped. Which are you, He considered the question seriously. I was peace before I left. Now I do not know what I am. They stood together in the gathering dark, two people bound by vows and necessity, trying to find their way towards something that might one day be real. That night, Grace dreamed of her father. He stood in the meadow, his medical bag in his hands, smiling the way he used to smile when she got something right. He did not speak, but she felt his approval like warmth against her skin. She woke before dawn to find Caleb already up, checking the horses, preparing for the final day's journey. Grace emerged from her shelter and helped him pack the wagon. They were developing a rhythm now, a pattern of working together without needing to discuss every detail. The third day's climb was the hardest. The road became barely more than a trail, rocky and steep. Twice, Caleb had to stop and move boulders that had rolled into the path. Grace got down and walked, easing the horse's burden, her legs burning with effort. But finally, as afternoon sun slanted long across the peaks, they reached the pass Caleb had pointed to the night before. The wagon crested the rise, and for a moment they were suspended between earth and sky. Then the land opened below them. Grace's breath caught. A wide valley spread beneath them, cut between steep slopes, green and lush and impossibly perfect. A river wound through the center, catching sunlight like molten silver. Forest covered the slopes in waves of dark pine. Even from this height, she could see meadows, clearings, the gleam of smaller creeks. It was beautiful beyond anything she had imagined, untouched and wild and somehow welcoming. But Grace was not looking at the valley anymore. She was looking at what sat in the center of it. A large building rose from the valley floor, built of heavy logs and river stone. 2 stories tall, with broad porches wrapping around it. Tall windows reflected the afternoon sun. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Around it spread outbuildings, barns, corrals, all built with the same careful craftsmanship. This was not a cabin. This was not a rough mountain dwelling. This was something else entirely. Grace turned slowly to look at Caleb. Her face had gone pale. Her voice came out flat, stripped of emotion by shock. What is this? Caleb's hands were white-knuckled on the reins. He did not look at her. That is Winter Ridge. The building is called Winter House. It is my home. Your home. Grace repeated the words like they were in a foreign language. You said you were a mountain man. You let me think you were poor. I am a mountain man. I live simply, but I never said I was poor. His voice was quiet, careful. I said I had land. That was true. You lied by omission. Anger was starting to burn through the shock. You let me believe you were offering me a cabin and a hard life. That is not a cabin, Caleb. That is a mansion. It is a lodge, he said, still not looking at her. There is a difference. Not to me, Grace's voice rose despite her attempt at control. You deceived me. You made me think I was helping you when all along I was the one being helped. I am not your wife. I am your charity case. Finally, Caleb turned to face her. His expression was anguished, more emotion than she had seen from him in 3 days. No, you are not charity. I need you, Grace. Not your pity or your gratitude. I need your partnership. For what you clearly do not need money. You have all of this. She gestured at the valley below. What could you possibly need from me? The truth, Caleb said. Someone who sees me, not what I own. Someone who understands that wealth is not the same as worth. The wagon sat at the top of the pass, neither going forward nor back. Grace felt like she was suspended too caught between anger and confusion and the dawning realization that she had married a man she did not know at all. Drive on, she said finally. I need to see what I have gotten myself into. Caleb clicked to the horses and the wagon began its descent into the valley. With each turn of the wheels, Winter House grew larger. Grace could see details now. Glass windows, carved railings, a chimney made of fitted stone. Quality everywhere. Care in every board and nail. They rolled down the winding track and across the valley floor. A man stepped out onto the front porch as they approached. He was older, maybe 55, with graying hair and capable hands. He wore clean work clothes and walked with the confidence of someone who knew his place and purpose. Mr. Winters, he called out, we've been expecting you. Everything is ready. Mr. Winters, not Mr. Walker. Grace felt the last piece click into place. Caleb Walker was not his real name, or not his whole name. He was Caleb Winters, owner of Winter House, master of this valley. And she had married him thinking he was someone completely different. The wagon stopped in front of the lodge. Caleb climbed down and came around to help Grace. She did not want his hand, but pride would not let her make a scene in front of the watching man. She let Caleb assist her down, then pulled away as soon as her feet touched ground. Inside the grand hall took her breath away for the second time that day. A massive stone fireplace dominated one end. Paneled walls gleamed with beeswax polish. Rugs covered wide plank floors. Furniture that would not have looked out of place in a Denver mansion filled the space. Paintings of mountains and forests hung between windows that let in floods of light. Grace stood in the center of it all, feeling utterly out of place in her worn brown dress, her dusty boots, her travel-stained shawl. A woman appeared from a side door, older, stern-faced, wearing a housekeeper's apron. She looked at Grace with barely concealed disapproval. "Welcome to Winter House, ma'am," she said. The words were correct, but the tone was cold. "I am Mrs. Cooper. I manage the household." Grace could not find words to respond. Everything was too much, too overwhelming. She looked at Caleb and saw him transformed. In Pine Ridge, he had been rough, simple, almost humble. Here in this grand space, he stood differently. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted. He looked like what he was, the owner, the master, the man in charge. He caught her looking, and something like fear flickered across his face. Fear of losing her, fear that he had misjudged. "We should talk," he said quietly, privately. Grace nodded because what else could she do? She had married him. She was here hundreds of miles from everything she knew in a house that should not exist, wed to a man who was someone completely other than she had believed. Caleb led her to a study off the main hall. He closed the door and turned to face her. For a long moment that they stood in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken accusations and defenses and desperate attempts to explain the unexplainable. Finally, Caleb spoke. "My real name is Caleb Winters. My father was Ambrose Winters. He built a timber empire. When he died 5 years ago, he left me everything. This valley, the mill's 50,000 acres of forest." Grace sank into a chair because her legs would not hold her. 50,000 acres. Yes, in a company that employed 200 men, and contracts with Denver, and more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. His voice was bitter now. Everything except peace. "So you left." "So I left. I locked this house and walked away. I lived in a cabin 6 miles up the ridge. I hunted and trapped and tried to forget what my father built on the backs of men he exploited." Grace looked up at him sharply. "What do you mean exploited?" Caleb's face was haggard. My father was brilliant and ruthless. He clear-cut forests and caused landslides. 3 men died in one slide. He cheated workers on wages. He bribed officials. He built this empire through methods I could not stomach. I tried to change him. I failed. When he died, I inherited his kingdom and his sins both. But the will requires me to marry before age 29, or everything passes to my cousin Catherine. She will sell it all to the railroad. They will strip every tree and move on. What my father built through cruelty will be finished through greed. Either way, destruction wins. Grace pressed her hands to her temples. Too much information, too many revelations. Why not just let her have it? If you hate what your father did, why fight to keep it? Because I changed it, Caleb said intensely. In the 5 years since his death, I restructured everything. Fair wages, replanting programs, sustainable harvest. I fired the corrupt foreman and hired men like Samuel who treat workers with dignity. I can make this place what it should have been from the beginning, but only if I keep it. And for that, you need a wife. Yes. He knelt in front of her chair, his eyes level with hers. Grace, I deceived you about my wealth. That was wrong, but I did not lie about needing you. In Denver, women saw my money before they saw me. They wanted the fortune, not the man. I needed someone who would look at the valley and understand what is worth protecting. Someone who would choose stewardship over luxury. So you tested me, Grace said bitterly, watched me like a specimen, judged whether I was worthy. I watched to see who you truly were. And what I saw was someone who valued people over profit, who worked herself to exhaustion for siblings she loved, who treated poor miners with the same care rich men would pay for. I saw someone I could trust to help me do this right. Grace stood abruptly, forcing him to rise. She walked to the window and looked out at the valley. In the fading light, it looked almost unreal, too perfect, too much. When he agreed to marry you, I thought I was sacrificing myself to save my family, she said, marrying a poor mountain man to pay our debts. It felt noble, hard but necessary. Now I find out I married wealth. I am not a martyr. I am just another woman who married for money. No, Caleb's voice was fierce. You married for family, for responsibility. You would have made the same choice if I truly was poor. The money does not change your character. But it changes everything else. Grace turned to face him. How do I know you want me? Maybe you just needed anyone. Any woman willing to sign the papers before the deadline. Caleb crossed the space between them in 2 strides. He took her shoulders gently, his eyes burning with intensity. I could have found a dozen women in Denver willing to marry me. I chose you. Not because you were convenient, because you were right. Because when I watched you argue for fair measure at that store, I saw someone who would fight for what matters. Because when you treated that miner for free, I saw someone who understood value beyond coin. His hands dropped. He stepped back, giving her space. I will not force you to stay. The marriage can be annulled. You were deceived about my circumstances. Any court would grant dissolution. I will still pay your family's debts. I will settle money on Daniel and Emily. You can go back to Pine Ridge if you choose. Grace stared at him. The offer was genuine. She could leave, go back to her siblings, to the life she knew. She would be no worse off than before. Better even with the debt paid. But she looked again at the valley beyond the window, at the forest that had been given a chance to heal, at the potential for something good to grow from something that had been poisoned. She thought about the workers Caleb mentioned. Fair wages, dignity, a chance to make right what had been made wrong. And she thought about the man standing before her stripped of his defenses, offering her freedom even though it would cost him everything. Do you want me to stay? She asked quietly. Yes. No hesitation. Not to save my inheritance. To help me build something worth saving. You are a healer, Grace. I need that. This valley needs that. Not just medicine for bodies. Healing for what my father broke. Grace closed her eyes and took 3 long breaths. When she opened them, her decision was made. I will stay, but we start over. Honestly this time. No more secrets. You tell me everything about this place, the business, your plans. I am not decoration. I am partner, or I am nothing. Relief flooded Caleb's face. Partner, I swear it. And I need time. We are married legally, but I barely know you. The intimacy comes when I am ready, not before. I can wait. Grace held out her hand. Then we have an understanding. Caleb took her hand and they shook formal as a business agreement. It should have felt cold, but somehow it felt right. They were building something from honesty now, brick by brick. The sun had set while they talked. Through the window, stars began to appear over the valley. Grace watched them emerge and thought about her father's journal. His hope that she would use her healing gifts. His belief that she had something to offer the world. Maybe this was how it was meant to happen. Not through noble sacrifice, but through complicated bargain that might grow into something real. Not romance, not yet, but potential. The seed of partnership that might one day bloom into love. Show me my room, Grace said. Tomorrow you show me everything else. The operation, the workers, all of it. If I am to be partner, I need to understand what we are partnering in. Caleb smiled and it transformed his face. For the first time she saw not the stern mountain man or the wealthy heir, but someone younger and more hopeful than either mask allowed. Tomorrow, he agreed. Tonight, rest. You have traveled far. Mrs. Cooper appeared to show Grace to her room. It was large with a real bed, soft quilts, and a view of the valley. Grace stood at the window after the housekeeper left and looked out at her new home. 3 days ago, she had been in Pine Ridge desperate and nearly broken. Now she was here in this impossible valley, married to a man who was nothing like what she had expected. The future she had imagined was gone. In its place was something unknown and frightening and strangely full of promise. Grace touched the silver ring on her finger. G.M. Grace Morgan. Soon the engraving would include her new name, Grace Winters, wife, partner, healer. She did not know yet if she could love this man, but she knew she could respect him. And respect, her father had always said, was a solid foundation for anything worth building. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Tonight she would rest and prepare herself for whatever came next. Because one thing was certain, Grace Morgan Winters did not do anything by half measures. If she was going to be partner to a timber baron and healer to a mountain valley, she would do it right, or die trying. Morning light broke soft over Winter Ridge, touching the peaks with gold before spilling down into the valley. Grace woke in a bed too large, too soft, in a room too grand for someone who had spent her life in a doctor's cramped cabin. For a moment she did not remember where she was. Then memory returned with the weight of stone. She was married. She was wealthy. She was miles from everything she had ever known. Grace rose and dressed in one of her simple dresses, the fabric worn but clean. In the mirror she saw herself unchanged. Same auburn hair, same green eyes, same face that had looked back at her in Pine Ridge. But everything around her had transformed overnight. She was Grace Winters, now mistress of Winter House, though she felt like an imposter wearing someone else's life. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Cooper's voice stern and proper. "Breakfast is ready, ma'am. The dining room is prepared." Grace opened the door. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. But where is my husband?" The housekeeper's expression was carefully neutral, but Grace caught the flicker of disapproval. A wife who did not know her husband's schedule. A mountain girl pretending to belong in a grand house. "Mr. Winters is already at the mill, ma'am. He leaves before dawn most days. He said you were to rest and he would return at noon." Grace felt a spike of irritation. Partnership Caleb had promised. But he had left without waking her, without including her in the day's work. She tamped down the anger and nodded. "I will find the dining room myself, thank you." She wandered the halls of Winter House, learning its geography. The place was larger than she had realized. A library filled with books, a study with maps on the walls, bedrooms enough for 12 people, storage rooms, a kitchen that could feed an army, pantries stocked with supplies that would last months. The dining room held a table that could seat 20. A single place was set at one end. Grace sat and a young woman she had not met brought coffee and eggs and fresh bread. The food was good, but eating alone in such a cavernous space made Grace feel hollow. After breakfast, she found her medical bag in her room unpacked and waiting. Grace picked it up and walked outside, needing air, needing purpose. The valley spread before her in the morning light, beautiful and alien. She saw the outbuildings Caleb had mentioned, bunkhouses for workers, a barn with horses, a building that must be the mill's smoke rising from its chimney. Men were already at work. She could hear the distant sound of axes, the rumble of logs being moved. This was the operation Caleb claimed to have reformed. Grace decided to see for herself. She walked toward the workers' camp following a well-worn path. As she approached, men stopped their tasks to stare. A woman in their midst was unusual. The boss's new wife was a curiosity worth gawking at. Grace met their eyes without flinching. She had spent her life being underestimated. She knew how to hold her ground. An older man detached from a group and walked toward her. This must be Samuel, the foreman Caleb had mentioned. He had kind eyes and a weathered face, and he removed his hat as he approached. "Mrs. Winters," he said, "welcome to Winter Ridge. I am Samuel Porter, foreman. Is there something you need?" "I am a doctor," Grace said simply. "My father trained me. If any of your men are injured or ill, I can help." Samuel's eyebrows rose. "A doctor? That is welcome news. We have not had medical care close by. Nearest doctor is 2 days' ride." As if summoned by the words, a shout came from near the mill. Men ran toward the sound. Samuel's face tightened, and he moved fast for a man his age. Grace followed her medical instincts, taking over. A young man lay on the ground near a stack of logs. His leg was bent at an wrong angle, his face white with pain. Blood seeped through his trouser leg. The men around him looked helpless, uncertain. Grace pushed through. "Let me see him." She knelt beside the injured man and made a quick assessment. Thomas, someone called him. 20 years old, maybe less. The log had rolled and caught his leg, crushing it between timber and earth. The bone was broken. Badly. "Get him to my clinic," Grace ordered. Then she realized she did not have a clinic yet. "No, take him to Winter House. Carefully support his leg. Do not let it move." 4 men lifted Thomas as gently as they could. He groaned but did not scream. Grace walked beside them, her mind already cataloging what she would need. Splints, bandages, something for pain. She hoped her medical supplies were adequate. At Winter House, she commandeered a spare room on the ground floor and had them lay Thomas on the bed. Mrs. Cooper appeared scandalized by the intrusion of a bleeding worker into the house. Grace ignored her. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey. Bring all of it now." Something in her voice made the housekeeper obey, without argument. Grace turned to Thomas and spoke calmly the way her father had taught her. "Keep the patient calm, and half the battle was won. Thomas, I am going to set your leg. It will hurt badly, but if I do not do it, you will walk crooked for the rest of your life. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, his teeth clenched. "Do it, ma'am." Grace cut away his trouser leg and examined the break. The bone had not pierced the skin, which was a mercy, but the angle was severe. She would have to pull hard to realign it. Mrs. Cooper brought the supplies, and Grace poured whiskey over the wound, cleaning away blood and dirt. Samuel appeared in the doorway. "Can I help?" "Hold his shoulders. When I pull, he is going to fight. Keep him still." She gave Thomas a leather strap to bite down on, then poured whiskey into a cup and made him drink. It would not be enough to truly dull the pain, but it might take the edge off. Grace positioned her hands on Thomas's leg, feeling for the break. Then she pulled. Thomas screamed through the leather. Samuel held him down. Grace felt the bone grind shift and finally slide back into alignment. She worked quickly, splinting the leg with boards and binding it tight. Her hands were steady. Her father's hands, he used to say. Made for healing. When it was done, Thomas had passed out from the pain. Grace checked his pulse, strong and steady. She bandaged the smaller wounds and covered him with a blanket. "He will recover," she told Samuel. "But he needs to stay off that leg for 2 months. Complete rest. If he tries to work too soon, the bone will set wrong and he will be crippled." Samuel nodded gravely. "I will make sure. And Mrs. Winters, thank you. You just saved that boy's future." Grace washed the blood from her hands, feeling the familiar exhaustion that followed difficult work. But beneath the fatigue was satisfaction. This was what she was meant to do. This was purpose. When Caleb returned at noon, he found Grace in the makeshift clinic, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. Thomas sleeping peacefully. The smell of medicine and whiskey. Grace's dress stained with blood. "What happened?" Grace looked up. "Mill accident. Crushed leg." "I said it. He will live." Something crossed Caleb's face. Surprise, respect, maybe relief. You worked fast. It is what I do. She set down the pestle and faced him. You said I would have a clinic. I am claiming this room. I need it properly set up. Examining table cabinets for supplies, better light. Can you arrange that? Consider it done. Caleb came further into the room looking at Thomas. His wages will continue while he recovers, and his family will receive extra food from the stores. Grace felt a spark of approval. This was the man she had married, the one who valued workers as people rather than tools. That is good. His wife is pregnant. They need the stability. You spoke with her. She came running when she heard. I examined her too. The baby is healthy, but she needs rest and better food. I told her to come to me weekly. Caleb smiled, and it transformed his usually stern face. One morning and you have already made yourself essential. I told you I am partner, not decoration. I am beginning to understand that. He gestured toward the door. Come, let me show you the operation. You wanted to see everything. For the next hours, Caleb walked Grace through Winter Ridge. He showed her the sustainable forestry practices he had implemented. They only cut trees that were dead, diseased, or overcrowded. For every tree felled, 2 saplings were planted. The cuts were selective, leaving the forest able to recover and thrive. He showed her the mill where logs were processed into lumber. The equipment was well maintained, the workers careful and skilled. He explained the safety measures he had put in place after his father's negligent practices had killed 3 men. Grace watched and listened and asked questions. How many workers? 40 men total with families. What were the wages? $2 a day higher than standard. Housing provided free, along with food from the communal stores. Medical care non-existent until now. You have built something good here, Grace said finally. I can see why you want to protect it. Caleb's expression darkened slightly. My father built it on cruelty. I am trying to rebuild it on fairness. But the foundation is still cracked. That is why I need time. Time to make it right before anyone can tear it apart again. They stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. The afternoon sun slanted gold across the trees. Workers were heading back to camp, their day's labor done. Smoke rose from cabin chimneys as families prepared evening meals. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic. Your cousin, Catherine, Grace said. Tell me about her. Caleb's jaw tightened. She is my father's niece. Her mother was his sister. After her husband died 2 years ago, she became obsessed with the timber business. She thinks she could run it better than I can, expand faster, cut more profit, more. And if she inherits, she will sell the cutting rights to the railroad. They will strip the valley in 5 years and move on. The workers will be left with nothing. The forest will be dead. Everything I have tried to build will be ash. Grace heard the fear beneath his words. This was not about money or pride. This was about protecting something fragile and valuable from destruction. She understood that. Her whole life had been about protecting fragile things. Then we do not let her win, Grace said simply. Caleb looked at her, and in his eyes she saw hope struggling against doubt. You say that now, but you have not met her yet. Catherine is formidable. So am I. The words hung between them, a promise, a commitment. Grace had agreed to stay and fight. She did not make promises lightly. That night they ate dinner together in the smaller family dining room. Mrs. Cooper served them and withdrew, leaving them alone. The silence was awkward at first. They were still strangers in many ways, learning how to be in each other's presence. How is Thomas? Caleb asked. Sleeping. The pain will be significant for a few days. I will check on him tomorrow. The men are talking about you. Samuel says they are calling you the Angel of Winter Ridge. Grace snorted. Hardly angelic. I just did what needed doing. That is more than most people manage. They ate in silence for a moment. Then Grace gathered her courage and asked the question that had been nagging at her. Why did you really leave? You said your father's methods sickened you, but there must be more. Caleb set down his fork. His face was shadowed in the lamplight, older than his 28 years. There is, but it is a long story and not a pleasant one. We have time. He studied her, weighing whether to trust her with the full truth. Finally, he began to speak. My father was brilliant, ambitious. He built this company from nothing through sheer force of will. But he believed that business was war and the only rule was winning. He cut corners, ignored safety, bribed officials to look the other way when his practices violated regulations. Caleb's voice was flat, reciting facts, but Grace heard the pain beneath. 5 years ago, his foreman ordered a clear cut on a steep slope. I told my father it was dangerous. The trees were all that held the hillside stable. He ignored me, said I was too soft for business. What happened? It rained, 3 days of heavy spring rain. The hillside came down in a slide. It buried the workers' camp. 3 men died. One of them had a wife and 4 children. Grace closed her eyes. She could picture it. The mud and timber and screaming. The bodies pulled from the wreckage. The children made fatherless by greed. My father paid the widows off, Caleb continued, gave them money and told them to keep quiet. Then he went back to work as if nothing had happened. That night I confronted him, told him we had to change our practices, that we were responsible for those deaths. What did he say? He said business required hard choices, that 3 men were acceptable losses if the company stayed profitable, that I would understand when I grew up. Caleb's hands were fists on the table. I left the next morning, walked away from everything. I could not stay and watch him destroy more lives. But you came back when he died. I came back because I thought I could make it right. Use the inheritance to fix what he broke. Pay restitution to the families. Implement real safety measures. Rebuild the company into something that honored the forest instead of raping it. The bitterness in his voice was thick as poison. Grace reached across the table and touched his clenched fist. The gesture surprised them both. You are not responsible for your father's sins, she said quietly. But you are responsible for what you do with his legacy. You chose to make it right. That matters. Caleb looked at her hand on his. Some days I think I am just rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. Catherine will win eventually. She has lawyers and money and connections in Denver. What do I have? A hasty marriage and a desperate hope. You have me, Grace said, and I am not as helpless as I look. For the first time that evening, Caleb smiled. No, you are definitely not helpless. They sat together in the lamplight, hands touching across the table, 2 damaged people trying to build something whole from broken pieces. Outside nights settled over the valley. Inside, something fragile began to grow between them. Not love yet, but the possibility of it. The possibility was enough. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that began to feel almost natural. Grace established her clinic properly with Caleb providing everything she requested. And examining table cabinets for medicines, good lamps for working after dark. Workers and their families came to her with injuries and illnesses. She treated them all, learning their names, their stories becoming woven into the fabric of Winter Ridge. Thomas recovered under her care. His wife Martha gave birth to a healthy boy, and Grace delivered the baby in the early hours of a June morning. The gratitude in Martha's eyes when she placed the squalling infant in her arms was worth more than any payment. Grace and Caleb fell into patterns. They ate breakfast together now, Caleb waiting for her instead of leaving before dawn. They discussed the day's work like business partners. She told him about patience. He told her about timber yields and replanting schedules. Slowly, carefully, they were learning each other. The attraction between them grew harder to ignore. Grace caught herself watching him work, admiring the economical strength in his movements. Sometimes she found him watching her in return, his blue eyes intent before he looked away. They still slept in separate rooms, but the air between them carried weight now. Anticipation, awareness. Grace was beginning to think they might actually make this strange marriage work. Beginning to imagine a future here, roots going down into mountain soil. Then Catherine arrived. The dust cloud appeared on the valley road on a Thursday afternoon. Grace was in her clinic treating a child's infected cut when she heard the commotion outside. Horses, multiple horses, the expensive kind that came from Denver stables. She finished bandaging the child and stepped onto the porch. An elegant carriage had stopped in front of Winter House. Black lacquered wood brass fittings that gleamed in the sun. Horses that cost more than most men earned in a year. The carriage door opened and a woman stepped out. She was perhaps 45, dressed in deep burgundy silk that should have been impractical for mountain travel, but somehow looked perfect on her. Dark hair pinned in elaborate style, face beautiful in a cold, sharp way. She looked at Winter House like she already owned it. Behind her came 2 men, One wore a lawyer's dark suit and carried a leather case. The other was younger, dressed for outdoor work, but with mean eyes. Hired muscle, Grace thought. The kind of man who solved problems with fists. Caleb appeared from the mill office, his face going rigid as stone. Grace had never seen him look like that, completely shut down, every emotion locked behind walls. The woman saw him and smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Cousin Caleb, how good to see you again." "Catherine," his voice was flat, "you are early. I thought I would come inspect my future property." Catherine's eyes swept the valley possessively. "It has been too long since I visited Winter Ridge. You have let it become quite rustic." "It is a working operation, not a show place." "Yes, I can see that." Catherine's gaze landed on Grace. "And who is this? Do not tell me you have finally taken a housekeeper who does not look like she was carved from granite." Grace felt the insult like a slap. She was wearing a simple work dress, her hair in a practical braid, her hand still carrying the smell of the salve she had just applied. Next to Catherine's silk and jewels, she looked like exactly what she was, a country doctor's daughter playing at being a lady. Caleb moved to stand beside Grace. His presence was protective, claiming, "This is my wife, Grace Winters." The silence that followed was profound. Catherine's smile froze on her face. The lawyer behind her stopped mid-step. Even the hired man looked surprised. "Your wife," Catherine repeated slowly. "How unexpected. And how very convenient, given the terms of your father's will." "I married Grace 3 weeks ago in Pine Ridge. We are legally wed. The will's requirements are satisfied." Catherine laughed. The sound was musical and utterly without warmth. "Oh, Caleb, did you really think it would be that easy? Marry some desperate mountain girl and keep your inheritance? You must think me a fool." Grace felt anger kindle in her chest. "I am not desperate, and I am not a fool either." Catherine turned her attention fully to Grace for the first time. Her eyes were intelligent in assessing, taking in every detail. "No. Then what are you, my dear? Let me guess. Poor family, overwhelming debts, handsome stranger, offers salvation if you will just sign your name to a marriage certificate. Does that about cover it?" "That is enough," Caleb said sharply. But Catherine was not finished. She stepped closer to Grace, studying her like an interesting specimen. "What did he promise you?" "Money for your siblings. A house, perhaps a little clinic to play doctor, and all you had to do was pretend to be his loving wife for a few weeks until the inheritance cleared." Grace met her eyes without flinching. "You do not know anything about me. I know you are common, uneducated, completely unsuited to be mistress of an estate like Winter Ridge. I know Caleb chose you because you were cheap and available. And I know that when the territorial court examines this farce of a marriage, they will see it for exactly what it is: a legal fiction designed to circumvent the will." The lawyer stepped forward, pulling papers from his case. "Mrs. Winters, I am attorney Morrison from Denver. I represent Mrs. Catherine Blackwood in a legal challenge to your marriage. We have filed a petition with the territorial court claiming the union is invalid due to fraudulent intent." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her. "Invalid. The will specifies marriage before age 29, Morrison explained in a smooth practice voice. "But it clearly intends a legitimate union, not a business arrangement. We have evidence that your marriage to Mr. Winters was contracted purely to satisfy the inheritance clause. Such marriages are not recognized under territorial law." Caleb's face had gone white. "You cannot prove that." "Can we not?" Catherine smiled. "We have already taken depositions from people in Pine Ridge. The shopkeeper who says you asked about Grace's financial situation. The reverend who admits the marriage was arranged with suspicious speed. Even that sweet old miner who mentioned you had been watching her for weeks like a predator stalking prey." She pulled a document from Morrison's case and waved it like a weapon. "I have filed a formal challenge. The court will hear arguments in 3 weeks. If the judge rules the marriage invalid, you will have missed the deadline. The estate passes to me. All of it." "You will lose," Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Will I?" Catherine looked between them, her smile sharpening. "Here is what I see. Two strangers who barely know each other. A marriage contracted in days. Separate bedrooms. No evidence of genuine affection. The court will see a desperate man and a woman who sold herself for security. They will annul this joke of a marriage and I will finally get what should have been mine all along. She gestured to Morrison and the hired man. Bring my things. I will be staying in the guest wing while this matter is resolved. Caleb stepped forward. You are not welcome here. But darling cousin, this is disputed property now. Until the court rules, I have every legal right to occupy Winter House. Morrison, show him the order. The lawyer produced another document. Grace could not read all the legal language, but she understood enough. Catherine had obtained a court order allowing her to reside at Winter Ridge pending the hearing. They could not force her to leave. Catherine swept past them toward the house, her silk dress rustling. Do not worry, I will stay out of your way. Mostly. Though I must say I am quite looking forward to getting to know you better, dear Grace. A country doctor's daughter trying to play at being a timber baroness. It will be entertaining to watch. She disappeared inside. Morrison and the hired man followed with her luggage. Grace and Caleb stood alone on the porch, the wreckage of their tentative peace scattered around them. She cannot win, Grace said. The marriage is legal. We said vows. Caleb's expression was bleak. Legal and legitimate are not the same thing. If the court decides we married fraudulently, they can annul it retroactively. I will have missed the deadline. Catherine gets everything. Then we prove the marriage is real. How she is right about everything. We are strangers. We do not share a bed. We have no history together. What evidence do we have that this is anything more than a business arrangement? Grace grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. We have 3 weeks. We use them. We become the couple we claim to be. We build evidence that this marriage is genuine. You want to lie. I want to survive. Grace's grip tightened. You said you needed a partner, someone who would fight for this valley. I am fighting. The question is whether you are willing to fight beside me. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. The defeated slump of his shoulders straightened, his jaw set with determination. What do you need me to do? First, we move into the same bedroom. Night. If Catherine wants evidence of a real marriage, we give it to her. Grace, I will not force you into intimacy you are not ready for. You are not forcing me, I am choosing. This is war, Caleb. Catherine fired the first shot when she arrived with her lawyers and her smug certainty. I intend to win. Grace turned and walked toward the house. Caleb followed, and for the first time since Catherine's carriage had appeared on the road, Grace felt something other than fear. She felt fury. Cold, clear, absolute fury. At Catherine for her assumptions. At the system that would dismiss Grace's worth because of her background. At the unfairness of having to prove her marriage was real when the only thing fake about it was how it started. But beginnings could be rewritten. Partnerships could become more. And Grace Morgan Winters had survived too much to let one elegant woman in silk destroy everything she was starting to build. If Catherine wanted a war, Grace would give her one. That night, Grace moved her belongings into Caleb's bedroom. It was large and masculine with heavy furniture and windows overlooking the valley. The bed was massive enough for 2 people to sleep without touching if they chose. Caleb watched her unpack with careful neutrality. I can sleep on the floor if you prefer. No, we share the bed. Catherine has spies. Mrs. Cooper probably reports everything. We need to appear completely married. Grace, about what you said earlier, about becoming the couple we claim to be. I do not expect you to manufacture feelings you do not have. Grace set down the dress she was folding and looked at him. Really looked. He stood awkward in his own room, trying to give her space, trying to be honorable when she was asking him not to be. I do not have to manufacture anything, she said quietly. I already respect you. I already trust you more than I thought possible after 3 weeks. The rest will come or it will not. But we have to try. Caleb nodded slowly. Then we try. They prepared for bed in silence. Grace changed in the small dressing room, emerging in her nightgown, feeling exposed despite the modest fabric. Caleb wore a simple cotton nightshirt. They climbed into the bed from opposite sides, the mattress dipping under their weight. The space between them felt enormous and impossibly small at once. Grace lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of Caleb's breathing beside her. This was the closest they had been, the most intimate, and yet they were still careful not to touch. Grace, yes, thank you for staying, for fighting. I know this is not what you signed up for. Neither of us signed up for Catherine. Grace turned her head to look at him. In the moonlight through the window, his profile was strong and clean. But we will face her together. Together, he agreed. They lay in silence after that. Eventually, exhaustion claimed Grace, and she drifted into uneasy sleep. Sometime in the night, she woke to find herself pressed against Caleb's side, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her. She started to pull away, then stopped. This was what married couples did. This was the evidence they needed. And if it felt good, warm, and safe in a way she had not felt since her father died, well, that was nobody's business but her own. She closed her eyes and let herself sleep. The next 2 weeks were a careful performance for an audience of one. Grace and Caleb ate meals together, sat close on the porch in the evenings, walked through the valley hand in hand. They were building the appearance of affection, creating a story Catherine could not dismantle. But something unexpected was happening beneath the performance. The fake affection was becoming real. Grace found herself looking forward to evenings on the porch to Caleb's dry observations about the day. She liked the way he listened when she talked about her patients, asking intelligent questions, taking her work seriously. She liked his hands scarred and capable. She liked the way he moved through the world with quiet competence. And Caleb was changing too. He smiled more, laughed at Grace's sardonic comments about Catherine's elaborate wardrobe, touched Grace's hand or shoulder, casually, gestures that started as performance but became habit. Catherine watched everything with knowing eyes. She made pointed comments at dinner about how lovely it was to see young love. Her tone suggested she found it completely unconvincing. But she was watching. That was what mattered. Then came the night that changed everything. Grace was working late in her clinic, treating a logger who had gashed his arm. Catherine appeared in the doorway, watching with false interest as Grace stitched the wound closed. "You are quite skilled," Catherine said when the worker had left. "Your father taught you well." Grace washed her hands wary. Catherine never gave compliments without agenda. "He was a good teacher." "I have been thinking about you, Grace, about your situation." Catherine settled into a chair, her silk dress pooling around her like wine. "You are trapped in an impossible position. Married to a man you barely know, caught up in his legal problems, forced to pretend affection you do not feel." "I am not pretending anything." Catherine laughed softly. "Please, I have eyes. You and Caleb are performing for my benefit, holding hands on the porch, sharing meaningful glances. It is all very sweet and completely hollow." Grace dried her hands, slowly choosing her words. "You do not know what is between Caleb and me. I know he needs you to save his inheritance. And I know you are not stupid enough to believe this marriage is anything more than a business transaction." Catherine leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost sympathetic. "But here is the truth, my dear. You do not have to be a pawn in this game. What are you suggesting? Walk away. Take whatever settlement Caleb offered your family and go back to Pine Ridge. The court will annul the marriage. You will be free of this farce. Your siblings will be provided for. Everyone wins except Caleb, and frankly, he brought this on himself." Grace felt ice form in her chest. "And if I refuse, then you will be dragged through a very public court case where your entire life is examined. Your poverty, your father's debts, your desperation. Lawyers will paint you as a fortune hunter who sold herself for security. Win or lose, your reputation will be destroyed. My reputation does not concern me." "Perhaps it should." Catherine's voice hardened. "Because if you fight me and lose, you will have nothing. No husband, no home, no respect. You will be the laughing stock of the territory, the naive girl who thought she could trap a wealthy man and failed." She stood and moved to the door, pausing to deliver her final strike. "Think about it, Grace. 3 weeks of humiliation in exchange for what? The chance to stay married to a man who chose you because you were convenient. Is that really worth fighting for?" Catherine left. Grace stood alone in her clinic, hands shaking with rage and something else, doubt. Because Catherine was right about one thing. The court case would be brutal. Grace's entire life would be put on display. Every desperate choice, every moment of poverty, examined and judged by strangers. Could she endure that? And more importantly, was Caleb worth it? She found him in the study poring over legal documents. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the exhaustion in his face. the weight of trying to save everything. Catherine came to see me, Grace said. Caleb's expression tightened. What did she want? To offer me a way out, annul the marriage, take a settlement, walk away clean. He went very still. Are you considering it? Grace crossed to the desk and looked down at the papers scattered there. Depositions, legal arguments, evidence that would be used to tear their marriage apart. Then she looked at Caleb, really looked at him. She saw a man who had walked away from his father's cruelty, who had tried to rebuild something poisoned into something healthy, who treated workers with fairness when he could have exploited them, who had chosen Grace not for convenience but because he believed she would understand what mattered. No, she said firmly, I am not considering it. I am staying. We are fighting together. Relief flooded Caleb's face. He stood and came around the desk, and before Grace quite knew what was happening, he pulled her into his arms. The embrace was fierce, grateful, desperate. Grace wrapped her arms around him and held on just as tightly. Thank you, he whispered into her hair. Thank you for not giving up. Grace pulled back just enough to look into his face. I am not giving up. But Caleb, if we are going to win this, we need to stop performing and start being real with each other. What do you mean? I mean, I need to know everything. Your father's sins, your guilt, why you really came back, all of it, because Catherine will use it against us and I need to be prepared. Caleb's arms dropped. He stepped back, walls going up. You do not want to know those things. Yes, I do. Partnership means sharing the ugly truths, not just the pleasant lies. He turned away, staring out the window at the dark valley. For a long moment, Grace thought he would refuse. Then he began to speak, his voice low and pained. He told her everything. Not just the landslide, but all of it. How his father had cheated native tribes on timber contracts. How he had bribed territorial officials to ignore environmental violations. How he had worked men to exhaustion and fired them when they were too injured to continue. How young Caleb had watched and protested and been ignored until he could not stomach his own complicity anymore. I should have stayed, Caleb said finally. Should have fought harder. Instead, I ran away to the mountains and told myself I was taking a moral stand. But really, I was just a coward. And those 3 men died because I was not there to stop it. Grace absorbed all of it, the guilt, the shame, the desperate attempt at redemption through reform. When he finished, she spoke carefully. You were young. You tried to change your father and failed. That does not make you responsible for his choices. I was his son. I had influence. Had you? Or did you tell yourself that because it hurts less than accepting, he did not care about your opinion? Grace moved to stand beside him at the window. Caleb, you cannot undo what your father did, but you can make sure Winter Ridge never operates that way again. That is redemption. Rebuilding what was broken into something that honors the dead instead of adding to their number. Caleb looked at her with something like wonder. How are you so wise? I am not wise. I am just practical. Guilt is useless unless it drives you to do better. She took his hand, weaving her fingers through his. We are not fighting, Catherine, to keep money or land. We are fighting to protect what you are building here. A business that treats people with dignity. A forest that can heal. That is worth defending. And us, Caleb asked quietly, what are we fighting for? Grace looked up at him, at this complicated man who had chosen her when he could have chosen anyone, who trusted her with his darkest secrets, who was trying so hard to be better than what he came from. We are fighting for the chance to find out what we could be, she said, if we are given time. Caleb pulled her close again, and this time when their lips met, it was not performance or pretense. It was real, hungry and desperate, and full of hope against hope. Grace kissed him back, tasting possibility, feeling the future crack open like dawn. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. Whatever happens in Denver, I will not regret marrying you. Good, because I am starting to think it might be the smartest thing I ever did. They stood together in the study, holding each other, while outside the night deepened, and Catherine plotted, and 3 weeks counted down to judgment. But for this moment, they had each other, and that felt like enough. 2 days later, the mill brake failed. Samuel brought the news at breakfast, his face grim. Someone cut the brake cable. Young Ben was working the saw when it let go. Log swung free and caught his leg. Lucky it did not kill him outright. Grace was already moving, grabbing her medical bag. Caleb followed his expression, dark with fury. Sabotage. Someone was actively trying to harm his workers. They found Ben in his cabin, his leg crushed again in almost the same place Grace had set it months before. This time the damage was worse. Bone fragments, massive bleeding. Grace worked for 3 hours to save the leg, and even then she was not certain it would heal properly. When Ben's wife Sarah finally stopped sobbing and Grace had done all she could, Samuel pulled Caleb aside. Grace followed, exhausted and blood-spattered. "It was deliberate," Samuel said quietly. "I checked the break myself last night. Cable was whole. This morning, clean cut. Someone wanted this to happen." "Catherine," Grace said. Caleb shook his head. "She is cruel but not stupid. She would not risk a murder charge." "Not her personally, but what about that man she brought, the one with dead eyes?" Samuel's expression turned thoughtful. "Pike, he has been asking around, talking to the younger workers, making offers." "What kind of offers?" "Money. If they are willing to leave Winter Ridge and work for Mrs. Blackwood's railroad concerns. Higher wages, he says. Better conditions." Caleb's jaw clenched. "She is trying to take my workers." "3 men have already accepted," Samuel admitted. "Frank James and young Tom. They gave notice this morning, said they are heading to Denver next week." Grace felt the ground shift. Catherine was not just challenging the marriage. She was systematically dismantling everything Caleb had built, taking workers, creating unsafe conditions, destroying the community from within. That afternoon, Grace did something she had never done before. She called a meeting. All the workers gathered in the large barn. 40 men, their families' children running between the adults. Grace stood on a hay bale so everyone could see her, feeling ridiculous and determined in equal measure. "I know Mrs. Blackwood has been making offers," she began. Her voice was steady despite her nerves. "Higher wages, modern equipment, new opportunities. And I know some of you are considering leaving." Murmurs of agreement. Grace pressed on. "I cannot match her wage offers. I am not a wealthy woman. I came to Winter Ridge 3 months ago with nothing but a medical bag and a family to support. But I can tell you what you will find if you leave." She looked at the faces watching her. Men she had treated, women whose babies she had delivered, children she had taught to read when their parents worked late. "You will find wages that seem generous until you realize there is no housing provided, no medical care, no safety equipment. You will find foremen who care about production numbers, not whether you live or die. You will find that when you are injured, you are disposable. Because that is how Mrs. Blackwood's companies operate. People are resources to be used up and discarded." "And here," someone called out. "What do we have here?" "Community," Grace said simply. "You have fair wages and free housing. You have medical care that does not bankrupt you. You have a boss who shut down the mill for 3 days after Ben's accident to check every piece of equipment personally. You have children who can go to school instead of working in mines. You have futures." She stepped down from the hay bale and walked among them. "I am asking you to trust that Caleb and I are building something worth keeping, something that values you as people, not just labor. Mrs. Blackwood offers money. We offer home. You decide which matters more." The barn was silent when she finished. Then Martha, Ben's wife, spoke up. "My husband nearly died today. Mrs. Winters saved his leg, saved our livelihood. No amount of wages from Denver can replace that." Others nodded. Samuel stepped forward. "I have worked for 3 timber companies in my life. 2 of them worked me like a book and threw me away when I got hurt. Mr. Winters treats us with respect. That is worth more than an extra 50 cents a day." The meeting broke up slowly. Some men looked convinced, others uncertain. But Grace had made her stand. She had fought for what they were building here, and that had to count for something. That night, as Grace and Caleb prepared for bed, he caught her hand. "What you did today, that was extraordinary. It was necessary." "No, it was brave." He pulled her close. "Catherine wants to destroy us, but you stood up and fought back. You reminded people what we are really fighting for." Grace leaned against him, exhausted in body and spirit. "Will it be enough? I do not know, but it gives us a chance." Caleb tilted her face up to his. "Grace, about what Catherine said. About the court case, if you want to change your mind, I would understand. I am not changing my mind. The trial will be brutal. They will attack your character, your motives, your worth. Are you prepared for that? Grace thought about her father, about Daniel and Emily depending on her strength, about the workers looking to her for hope, about Caleb trying so hard to redeem his father's sins. I am prepared, she said firmly. Let them attack. I know who I am, and I know what we are building is real. Caleb kissed her, then deep and urgent, and Grace kissed him back with equal hunger. When they tumbled into bed together, there was no more performance, no more pretense. Just two people reaching for each other in the darkness, finding comfort and passion, in the beginning of something that might one day be called love. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Grace felt the last walls between them crumble. This marriage was real now. Whatever the court decided, that truth could not be taken away. 3 days before they were scheduled to leave for Denver, Pike made his final move. Catherine's hired man gathered the workers and offered them a choice. Leave now with bonuses or stay and face the consequences when Catherine took over. 3 more men accepted. 7 total had now abandoned Winter Ridge for Catherine's promises. But 33 remained. 33 men who chose community over money, who trusted Caleb's vision more than Catherine's gold. It was not a complete victory, but it was enough. On the morning they departed for Denver, the entire valley turned out to see them off. Workers aligned the road, wives waved handkerchiefs, children threw wildflowers. Samuel shook Caleb's hand and promised to keep everything running in their absence. Grace sat beside Caleb in the wagon looking back at Winter Ridge as they climbed toward the pass. The valley spread below them, green and beautiful and fragile. So much depended on what happened in the next weeks. Whatever the court decides, Caleb said quietly, thank you for standing with me. Grace took his hand and held it tight. We stand together. That is what partners do. The wagon crested the pass and Winter Ridge disappeared behind them. Ahead lay Denver Catherine's lawmakers, a courtroom full of judgment. But Grace was not afraid anymore. She had found something worth fighting for, and she would not surrender it without a battle. The road to Denver wound down from the mountains like a river finding the sea. Grace sat beside Caleb in the wagon, watching the wild country give way to settled farms and then to the sprawl of civilization. Behind them, Winter Ridge receded into memory. Ahead lay judgment, but this journey was different from the one 3 months before. Then Grace had been a frightened bride traveling toward the unknown. Now she was a woman with purpose, riding beside her husband to defend what they had built together. The difference was everything. They camped the first night beside a creek that fed into the South Platte. Samuel and 2 workers traveled with them, men who had volunteered to testify on Caleb's behalf. They built a fire together and shared a simple meal, the easy camaraderie of people united in common cause. After the others had rolled into their blankets, Grace and Caleb sat by the dying fire. Caleb held papers he had been studying, legal arguments that Judge Harrison had prepared. His face looked older in the firelight, carved by worry. What will they ask me? Grace said quietly. Caleb set down the papers. Everything. When we met. Why you agreed to marry. Whether you knew about the inheritance. They will try to prove you were a fortune hunter who trapped me. And what do I say? The truth. That you married me to save your family. That you did not know about my wealth. That what we have built together is real. He paused. Grace, they will be cruel. Morrison is good at making people doubt themselves. Do not let him. Grace stared into the embers. I am not afraid of questions. I am afraid of failing you, of saying the wrong thing and losing everything we have fought for. Caleb reached over and took her hand. The gesture was automatic now, natural. You cannot fail me. Just by standing beside me in that courtroom, you will have done more than I had any right to ask. She looked at him, this man who had been a stranger 4 months ago and was now woven into every part of her life. When this is over, win or lose, what happens to us? What do you want to happen? Grace chose her words carefully. I want us to be real, not because of Catherine or the court or the inheritance, just because we choose each other. Caleb's grip on her hand tightened. We already are real. Everything else is just paperwork. They sat together until the fire burned to ash, holding hands like children afraid of the dark. Because in some ways that was exactly what they were. 2 people trying to keep light alive against the consuming night. The second day brought them within sight of Denver. The city rose from the plains like something transplanted from another world. Brick buildings, paved streets, telegraph lines strung between poles like spider silk. The air smelled of coal smoke and horse manure, and too many people living too close together. Grace had not been back to Denver since her parents died. The memories pressed close. Her mother's final fever, her father's desperate attempts to save her, the cemetery where they both lay now far from the mountains they had loved. Caleb noticed her tension. "We can visit their graves if you wish, before the trial." "No," Grace's voice was firm. "I did not come here to mourn. I came here to fight." They checked into a hotel on Larimer Street. The building was respectable, but not grand, the kind of place where frontier families stayed when they came to the city on business. The clerk looked at Grace's worn traveling dress with barely concealed contempt, but Caleb's cold stare and the gold coins he laid on the counter changed the man's expression quickly enough. Their room was clean and small, one bed, a washstand, a window overlooking the street. Grace unpacked their few belongings while Caleb went to find Judge Harrison. She was hanging her dress when she heard shouting from below. Catherine had arrived. Grace went to the window and looked down. An elegant carriage had stopped in front of the heat hall next door, far grander than theirs. Catherine emerged in a cloud of peacock blue silk, followed by Morrison and half a dozen assistants carrying luggage and papers. But it was not the entourage that caught Grace's attention. It was the people gathering to watch. Well-dressed men and women, the kind who had nothing better to do than gawk at spectacle. Catherine was holding court on the sidewalk, her voice carrying up to Grace's window. "Such a shame about my poor cousin," Catherine was saying to a woman in an elaborate hat. "Trapped into marriage by a desperate fortune hunter. Of course I had to intervene. Family duty and all that." The woman with the hat clucked sympathetically. "These mountain girls have no scruples." "My dear, you are doing the Lord's work." Grace felt rage burn cold in her chest. She wanted to lean out the window and shout the truth, but Catherine was too smart for that. She was poisoning the well, turning public opinion against Grace before the trial even began. By the time they entered the courtroom, half of Denver would already believe Grace was a scheming gold digger. Caleb returned an hour later with Judge Harrison. The retired judge was 70 if he was a day, with white hair and eyes sharp as broken glass. He settled into the room's only chair and studied Grace with unsettling intensity. "Mrs. Winters, I have been reviewing the depositions Catherine's lawyers have gathered. I need to ask you some hard questions. Your answers will determine how we proceed." Grace sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. "Ask." "Did you know about Caleb Winters' wealth before you married him?" "No, he told me he was a mountain man named Caleb Walker. I believed him." "When did you learn the truth?" "On our journey to Winter Ridge, 3 days after the wedding." "How did you feel when you discovered the deception?" Grace met his eyes. "Angry, betrayed. I considered demanding an annulment." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "But you did not." "No, because beneath the deception was a good man trying to protect something worth saving. I chose to stay and help him." "Why be honest, Mrs. Winters? What did you gain from staying?" The question was a trap, and they both knew it. If she said money or security, she played into Catherine's narrative. If she claimed love, she would sound dishonest given the short timeline. Grace chose truth. "I gained purpose. My father was a doctor who spent his life helping people who could not pay. He died broke and in debt, but he died knowing his work mattered. At Winter Ridge, I could continue that work. Heal people. Build something that valued care over profit. That was worth staying for." Harrison studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Good. That is the line we will take. You are not a fortune hunter. You are a healer who found a place where her skills were needed and valued. Stick to that story because it has the virtue of being true." "It is not a story," Grace said quietly. "It is my life." "Even better." Harrison pulled out papers covered in notes. "Now let me tell you what Morrison will do. He will paint you as desperate and conniving. He will suggest you research. Caleb planned the encounter, manipulated him into marriage. He will question every choice you made, every word you spoke, every gesture of affection. How do we counter that? With witnesses who can testify to your character, with evidence of genuine partnership, with the fact that you have worked at Winter Ridge, built a clinic, treated workers without payment. Actions speak louder than denials." They spent the next hours preparing. Harrison drilled Grace on likely questions, teaching her to answer concisely without sounding defensive. Caleb paced the small room, his tension palpable. A knock came at the door. Caleb opened it to reveal Reverend Thompson, dusty from travel and beaming with determined kindness. "I came as soon as I heard about the trial," the old minister said. "Could not let you face those wolves alone." Grace stood shocked and moved. "Reverend, you did not have to come all this way." "Nonsense. I married you two. I saw the sincerity in both your eyes. No court is going to tell me I performed a fraudulent ceremony." He looked at Harrison. "I assume you can use a character witness." Harrison smiled for the first time. "Reverend, you just became our most valuable asset." That night, Grace could not sleep. She lay beside Caleb in the narrow hotel bed, listening to the city sounds that never quite died. Somewhere a piano played. Voices shouted in drunken argument. A train whistle blew lonely and distant. "Are you awake?" Caleb whispered. "Yes." Scared. Terrified. He rolled to face her. In the darkness, she could barely see his outline. "We could still run, take what money I have, and start over somewhere else. California, maybe. Or Oregon. Somewhere Catherine cannot reach. And leave Winter Ridge to her. Let her destroy everything you built. Better that than watch them destroy you in that courtroom." Grace reached out and found his face with her hand. "They cannot destroy me. I am not that breakable." "Everyone is breakable, Grace. Then we will break together if we have to, but we will not run." Caleb caught her hand and kissed her palm. "I do not deserve you." "Probably not, but you are stuck with me anyway." They made love, then quiet and desperate, clinging to each other like drowning people. Afterward, Grace lay in Caleb's arms and tried not to think about what morning would bring. She failed. Morning came too soon and too bright. Grace dressed in her best dress, the brown one she had worn to their wedding. It was plain and serviceable, nothing like Catherine's silks. But it was honest. It was her. The territorial courthouse was a massive brick building that dominated an entire block. People crowded the steps, drawn by gossip and the promise of scandal. Grace walked through them with her head high, refusing to look down. Caleb's hand was steady at her elbow. Samuel and the other workers followed behind like an honor guard. Inside the courtroom was all dark wood and solemn authority. The ceiling soared overhead. Windows let in bars of dusty sunlight. The judge's bench loomed at the front like an altar. Catherine was already seated at the plaintiff's table, immaculate in deep green silk. Morrison sat beside her with his papers arranged in perfect stacks. They looked confident, prepared, certain of victory. Grace took her seat beside Caleb at the defendant's table. Harrison sat on Caleb's other side, his old hands steady on his documents. The courtroom filled with spectators, curious citizens come to watch the mountain girl who had tried to trap a timber baron. A bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Wheeler." The judge entered, and Grace felt her stomach drop. Wheeler was 60, stern-faced, with the kind of eyes that had seen every trick and lie the world had to offer. He looked at Grace with a long, assessing stare, and she could not read his expression at all. Wheeler settled into a seat and gestured for everyone to sit. The rustling of fabric and scraping of chairs sounded overloud in the tense space. "This court will hear the matter of Blackwood versus Winters," Wheeler said. His voice was deep and carried absolute authority. "Mrs. Catherine Blackwood challenges the validity of the marriage between Caleb Winters and Grace Morgan Winters on grounds of fraudulent intent. Mr. Morrison, present your case." Morrison rose with the fluid confidence of a man who had won 100 such battles. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that this marriage was a calculated business arrangement designed to circumvent the requirements of Ambrose Winters' will. Miss Morgan, a woman of no means and desperate circumstances, was recruited by Mr. Winters for the sole purpose of satisfying the marriage clause before his 29th birthday. This was not a union of hearts, but a legal fiction. We ask the court to declare it invalid and restore the proper inheritance to Mrs. Blackwood." He sat down. Grace felt dozens of eyes on her, judging, measuring, finding her wanting. Harrison stood. He moved slowly, an old man gathering his thoughts, but when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. "Your Honor, the law does not require romance before marriage. It requires only free consent between parties of sound mind. Mr. Winters and Miss Morgan both freely consented. They spoke vows before witnesses. They have built a life together. The marriage is legitimate under every legal standard. Mrs. Blackwood challenges it not from any legal principle, but from simple greed. She wants what is not hers. This court should not reward that. Wheeler listened without expression. Proceed with witnesses, Mr. Morrison. The parade began. First came Patterson, the shopkeeper from Pine Ridge. He testified that Caleb had asked questions about Grace's family circumstances before proposing. Under Morrison's gentle guidance, he made it sound calculated and predatory. But on cross-examination, Harrison got him to admit that asking about a potential wife's family was normal practice. You would not want your own son marrying without knowing the girl's background. Would you, Mr. Patterson? Well, no, but this was different. How? Patterson stammered and could not quite explain. Next came Mrs. Cooper, the housekeeper. Morrison asked about the sleeping arrangements at Winter House. Her testimony was damning. Separate bedrooms for weeks. No signs of genuine affection. Formal interactions between supposed newlyweds. Harrison's cross-examination was brief. Did the sleeping arrangements change, Mrs. Cooper? Well, yes, after a few weeks. And did you observe genuine affection develop between Mr. and Mrs. Winters? Mrs. Cooper's stern face softened slightly. I suppose I did. They seemed to grow closer. Is it possible, Mrs. Cooper, that what you witnessed was two people learning to trust each other and building a real marriage over time? I suppose it is possible. Frank, the worker who had defected to Catherine, testified next. He claimed Caleb had been distracted after the marriage, that the operation had suffered. But Harrison got him to admit he had accepted money from Catherine before leaving, undermining his credibility. Then came the defense witnesses. Samuel took the stand dignified in his Sunday clothes. He testified about Caleb's character, his fair treatment of workers, his dedication to Winter Ridge. Morrison tried to shake him, but Samuel was rock solid. Mr. Winters could have married any woman in Denver, Samuel said firmly. He chose Grace Morgan because she understood what mattered. Not money, people and land, and doing right. Reverend Thompson was even better. He testified about performing the ceremony, about counseling both parties beforehand, about seeing genuine commitment in their eyes. I have married 200 couples in 40 years, Thompson said. I know the difference between people going through motions and people making real vows. Mr. Winters and Miss Morgan meant what they said. Morrison's cross-examination was sharp. But Reverend, you admitted in your deposition that the marriage was arranged with unusual speed. 1 week from proposal to ceremony. Does that not suggest desperation rather than love? Thompson smiled gently. Young man, I have also married couples who courted for years and were divorced within months. And couples who barely knew each other, who stayed faithful for 50 years. The length of courtship tells you nothing about the strength of commitment. Ben testified next, hobbling to the stand on crutches. He told about his injury, about Grace's skill in saving his leg, about her refusal to accept payment. Mrs. Winters is the reason I can still work, still support my family. She did not have to help me, but she did. That tells you what kind of person she is. The morning wore on. Witness after witness, building a picture of Grace as healer partner, genuine member of the Winter Ridge community. But Morrison was good. He made each act of service sound suspicious, calculating. The behavior of someone trying to seem valuable so she could not be discarded. At noon, Wheeler called recess. Grace stumbled out of the courtroom drained. Caleb bought sandwiches from a street vendor, but Grace could not eat. Her stomach was tied in knots. You are doing well, Harrison assured her. The witnesses are helping. But Morrison is making me sound like a schemer. That is his job. This afternoon is your turn. You and Caleb both testify. That is when we win or lose. The afternoon session began with Caleb on the stand. Harrison led him through his testimony carefully. Why he had hidden his identity, why he had chosen Grace specifically, what their marriage had become. Caleb's answers were simple and direct. I needed someone who would see past wealth to what really mattered. Grace saw that. She still sees it. That is why I married her and why I would marry her again tomorrow if given the choice. Then Morrison stood for cross-examination. Grace watched him circle Caleb like a predator. Mr. Winters, you claim to have loved your wife. When did this love develop? Over time. through working together, building trust. But not before marriage. No, not before. So you married a woman you did not love in order to satisfy your father's will. I married a woman I respected with the hope that love would follow. It did. Morrison smiled coldly. How convenient. Tell me, Mr. Winters, if the court rules this marriage invalid, would you marry her again? Yes, immediately. Even if it meant losing your inheritance? Especially then, because then she would know I chose her, not the land. The answer seemed to surprise Morrison. He recovered quickly. You expect this court to believe you would sacrifice millions for a woman you barely knew 4 months ago. Caleb looked directly at Grace. I would sacrifice anything to keep her, because she is worth more than all of it. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. She blinked them back. Crying would look like manipulation. Morrison tried several more angles but could not shake Caleb's simple truth. Finally, he sat down looking frustrated. Mrs. Grace Winters, Wheeler said, please take the stand. Grace stood on shaking legs. The walk to the witness chair felt endless. Every eye in the courtroom followed her. She sat and placed her hand on the Bible the clerk held out. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Harrison approached with a kind smile. Mrs. Winters, please tell the court how you met Caleb Winters. Grace took a breath and began. She told about her father's death, the debts, the impossible situation, about Caleb's proposal and her reasons for accepting. Her voice was steady, clear. She met the eyes of the spectators without flinching. When did you learn about your husband's true circumstances? 3 days after our wedding, when we arrived at Winter Ridge and I saw Winter House for the first time. How did you feel? Angry, betrayed. I had thought I was making a noble sacrifice. Instead, I felt like charity. Why did you stay? Grace paused. This was the critical question. Everything hinged on her answer. Because I saw what he was trying to build. A business that valued people. Land managed with care instead of greed. Workers treated with dignity. I realized I could be part of something that honored my father's values. Healing and service and doing right. That was worth staying for. Harrison nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Winters. Your witness, Mr. Morrison. Morrison rose like a snake uncoiling. Grace braced herself. Mrs. Winters, you testified that you were in desperate financial circumstances before meeting Mr. Winters. Is that correct? Yes. $2,000 in debt. Yes. And your siblings faced being sent to an orphanage if you could not pay. Yes. So when Mr. Winters offered to pay that debt in exchange for marriage, you accepted immediately. Not immediately, I took 3 days to consider. Morrison's smile was sharp. 3 whole days, how thoughtful. Tell me, Mrs. Winters, did you investigate Mr. Winters before accepting? Ask anyone about his character or circumstances? I asked in town. People said he was honest. But you did not know he was wealthy. No. Yet you married him anyway. For $2,000 and the promise of land for your siblings. That is quite a price, is it not? Grace felt anger rise but kept her voice level. I married him to save my family. Yes. And when you discovered he was actually wealthy, you must have been quite pleased. I was shocked. But you stayed, despite the deception, despite barely knowing him. You stayed in that grand house with servants and luxury. Why, Mrs. Winters? Why stay if not for the money? Because he asked me to. Because he needed a partner, and I believed I could be that. Morrison leaned closer. Or because you realized you had hit the jackpot, a wealthy man who needed a wife. All you had to do was pretend affection and you would never have to worry about money again. That is not true. Is it not you claim to have built a real marriage, yet you slept in separate rooms for weeks? You barely knew each other. Even now you have been married only 4 months. 4 months, Mrs. Winters. That is not a marriage. That is a business arrangement. Grace felt the courtroom pressing in. Every face watching, judging, believing Morrison's poison. She looked at Caleb and saw his anguish. He thought she was going to break. She straightened her spine and met Morrison's eyes. You are right. 4 months is not long, but in those 4 months, I have delivered 3 babies, set 6 broken bones, treated 2 dozen illnesses, and saved 1 man's leg. I have taught 5 children to read and helped 10 families with medical problems they could not afford to treat elsewhere. I have worked alongside my husband to build a community that values care over profit. Her voice grew stronger. You call that a business arrangement, Oyan? Then it is the best business I have ever been part of. Because the payment I receive is knowing that when Martha's baby was breech and dying, I was there to turn him and bring him safely into the world. The payment is Thomas walking instead of limping for the rest of his life. The payment is seeing workers' children healthy and educated instead of broken and illiterate. Grace stood unable to stay seated any longer. Wheeler did not stop her. You ask if I love my husband. Yes, I love his integrity. I love that he walked away from his father's cruelty and spent 5 years trying to make it right. I love that he pays fair wages when he could exploit workers. I love that he plants 2 trees for everyone he cuts. I love that he chose me not because I was beautiful or refined or wealthy, but because he believed I would understand what really matters. She turned to face Wheeler directly. Your Honor, I will not stand here and pretend this marriage started with romance. It did not. It started with necessity and grew into partnership and became love through the work of building something together. If that is not a real marriage, then I do not know what is. But I know this. I would marry Caleb Winters again today, tomorrow, and every day after. Not for his money, for him. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Grace sat back down, her heart pounding. She had said too much, revealed too much. But it was the truth and she would not take it back. Morrison looked uncertain for the first time. No further questions. Harrison stood. Redirect, Your Honor. Mrs. Winters, if this court annuls your marriage today, what will you do? Grace did not hesitate. Find Caleb and ask him to marry me again. Even knowing you would lose the inheritance. The inheritance was never mine to lose. Caleb is mine. That is all that matters. Thank you, Mrs. Winters. No further questions. Wheeler looked at both lawyers. Anything else? Morrison shook his head, looking defeated. Harrison started to say no, then stopped. The courtroom door had opened. An old man entered, moving slowly but with unmistakable dignity. He was Native American Ute by the look of him, with white hair and long braids, and eyes that had seen 7 decades of change. He wore traditional clothing mixed with frontier practicality. Your Honor, the old man said in accented English, I am Blue Hawk. I have testimony about Ambrose Winters' will. Wheeler frowned. This is highly irregular. Who are you? I worked for Ambrose Winters for 40 years. I was present when he wrote his will. I was witness. Morrison shot to his feet. Objection. This witness was not listed. Because I only just learned of the trial, Blue Hawk said calmly. I came as soon as I heard. I have information the court needs. Wheeler considered. I will allow it, but keep it brief. Blue Hawk moved to the stand with surprising grace for his age. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore his oath. Then he looked at Wheeler with perfect composure. Ambrose Winters was hard man, cruel sometimes, but he loved this son. Blue Hawk gestured at Caleb. He knew the boy hated his business methods. They fought many times. When Ambrose got sick, he told me he would leave everything to Caleb but with condition. What condition? Wheeler asked. That Caleb must marry before 29 years. Ambrose said to me, I want my son to find woman who will make him better man. Not rich woman who wants my money. Woman with strength and heart. He said if Caleb found such woman, then Will succeeds. If not, then inheritance goes to Catherine. Morrison was on his feet. Hearsay, this is inadmissible. Blue Hawk reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper yellowed with age. Not hearsay. Ambrose gave me letter. Told me to keep it secret until needed. Now is the time. He handed the letter to Wheeler. The judge opened it carefully, reading the faded handwriting. His expression shifted. After a long moment, he looked up. This letter is dated 10 years ago. It is signed by Ambrose Winters in the presence of 2 witnesses. And it states, and I quote, if my son marries a woman who teaches him the value of people over profit of stewardship, over exploitation of service over greed, then the spirit of my will is satisfied regardless of timeline or circumstance. End quote. The courtroom erupted. Morrison looked like he had been struck. Catherine had gone deathly pale. Caleb gripped Grace's hand hard enough to hurt. Wheeler banged his gavel. Order Mr. Morrison, do you wish to authenticate this document? Morrison examined the letter with shaking hands. Grace saw him deflate. The signature appears genuine, Your Honor. Then I will accept it into evidence. Wheeler looked at Blue Hawk. Why did you wait until now? Ambrose told me if Catherine challenges Caleb's choice show letter. If she accepts it, stay silent. She challenged. So I came. You may step down. Wheeler waited until Blue Hawk had returned to the back of the courtroom. Then he looked at both tables. Does either side have anything else? Harrison stood. The defense rests, Your Honor. Morrison stood slowly. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, I request time to confer with my client. Denied. You have had 3 weeks to prepare your case. This court will not be delayed further. Wheeler gathered his papers. I will render my decision after a brief recess. 30 minutes. He left the bench. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. Catherine was shouting at Morrison. Spectators buzzed with speculation. Grace sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Caleb pulled her up and into his arms. We might win. Grace, we might actually win. Do not hope yet, Harrison cautioned. Wheeler is unpredictable. That letter helps, but he could still rule against us. The 30 minutes felt like 30 hours. Grace paced the hallway outside the courtroom, unable to sit still. Reverend Thompson prayed quietly in a corner. Samuel and the workers stood in a protective cluster around Caleb. Finally, the bailiff called them back inside. Grace returned to her seat, Caleb's hand in hers. Wheeler entered and the room fell silent. This court has considered all testimony and evidence, Wheeler began. His voice gave nothing away. The question before me is whether the marriage between Caleb Winters and Grace Morgan Winters is a legitimate union or a fraudulent arrangement designed to circumvent inheritance requirements. He paused and Grace felt her heart stop. I find the following facts. First, that Miss Morgan was indeed in desperate circumstances when she agreed to marry Mr. Winters. Second, that the marriage was arranged quickly with primarily practical considerations. Third, that Miss Morgan did not know of Mr. Winters' full wealth when she consented. Grace felt hope dying. He was going to rule against them. However, Wheeler continued, I also find that both parties consented freely and without coercion, that they spoke legitimate vows before a minister and witnesses, that they have subsequently built a working partnership and genuine affection, and most importantly, that the letter submitted by Mr. Blue Hawk clearly establishes Ambrose Winters' intent. He did not want his son to marry for tradition or society. He wanted him to find a true partner. Wheeler looked directly at Grace. Mrs. Winters, your testimony was the most honest I have heard in 20 years on the bench. You admitted the mercenary origins of your marriage without shame. You defended your choice with passion and integrity. You have demonstrated through your actions at Winter Ridge that you are exactly the kind of partner Ambrose Winters hoped his son would find. He turned to Caleb. Mr. Winters, you chose wisely. Better than your father, in fact. Where he sought profit, you sought partnership. That is growth. That is redemption. Wheeler banged his gavel once. This court finds the marriage between Caleb Winters and Grace Morgan Winters to be legitimate, legal, and entered in good faith by both parties. The will's requirements are satisfied. The petition for annulment is denied. Mr. Winters retains his inheritance. This court is adjourned. The courtroom exploded. Caleb pulled Grace into his arms and kissed her in front of everyone. Samuel and the workers cheered. Reverend Thompson wept openly. Harrison smiled his first real smile in days. Catherine sat motionless at her table, frozen in defeat. Morrison was already packing his papers, eager to escape. The spectators who had come expecting scandal were getting a different story. The mountain girl had won. Outside the courthouse, people crowded around, offering congratulations. Grace smiled and thanked them, but her mind was elsewhere. They had won the battle, but Catherine had not conceded the war. That woman did not accept defeat easily. Sure enough, as they walked back to the hotel, Catherine appeared. She had composed herself, her face a mask of cold fury. Congratulations, cousin, she said to Caleb. You have your inheritance. Enjoy it while it lasts. Catherine, it is over. Accept it. Oh, the legal battle is over. But there are other ways to destroy you. She smiled at Grace. Did you think winning in court meant you won everything? How naive. What do you want? Grace asked tiredly. To make you an offer. Want a last chance to salvage something from this disaster. Catherine gestured to Morrison, who produced papers. I still control the railroad contracts for this region. Every piece of timber from Winter Ridge must go through my rail lines to reach Denver markets. Currently, you have agreements at standard rates. She let that hang. Caleb's face went white. You would not. I would, and I will. As of today, Winter Ridge timber is blacklisted from my railroad. You cannot ship your product, which means you cannot sell it, which means your operation dies. You won the inheritance, Caleb, but I control your access to market. Without me, Winter Ridge is worthless. Caleb looked like he had been punched. Grace felt sick. Catherine was right. They could own the land, but if they could not sell the timber, the business would collapse. The workers would lose their jobs. Everything they had fought for would crumble anyway. Unless, Catherine continued smoothly, we come to an arrangement. Sell me 20,000 acres at fair market value. I get the timber rights I need. You keep Winter House and enough land to live comfortably. Your workers stay employed on my contracts. Everyone wins. Except the forest, Grace said. You will clear-cut those 20,000 acres. Business requires harvesting resources. I will be no worse than Ambrose was. That is not the recommendation you think it is. Catherine shrugged. Take the offer or refuse. But without railroad access, you have nothing but expensive land you cannot afford to maintain. Your noble experiment in sustainable forestry ends either way. The only question is whether you salvage anything from it. She walked away, leaving the papers with Morrison. Caleb stood frozen, all the joy of victory drained from his face. That night in their hotel room, they sat in silence. The celebration had turned to ashes. They had won the battle and lost the war. We could accept her offer, Caleb said finally. 20,000 acres. It would hurt, but we would survive. And watch her destroy what you have tried to save. No. Grace paced the small room. There has to be another way. There is not. Catherine controls the only railroad route from Winter Ridge to Denver. Without that, we have no market access. Grace stopped pacing. An idea was forming, risky and desperate. What if we did not need Denver markets? What? Denver is not the only city that needs timber. What about the western markets, California, Oregon? The railroad is expanding in those directions too. Caleb shook his head. Those roads do not connect to Winter Ridge. We would have to transport timber overland for hundreds of miles. The cost would be prohibitive. What about the river? You have a river running through the valley. Where does it go? It feeds into the Colorado, which eventually reaches the Western Territories. But Grace, floating logs that far is dangerous. We could lose half the timber in rapids, and it would take months. But it is possible. Caleb looked at her like she had grown a second head. Possible barely. Profitable never. What if we made it profitable not by undercutting prices, but by offering something Catherine cannot? Sustainable lumber, certified and guaranteed. Western cities are growing fast. They need quality timber, not just cheap volume. We market Winter Ridge as the ethical choice. That would take years to establish. Then we take years. We build slowly. We start small and grow as reputation spreads. Grace moved to sit beside him. Caleb, you have spent 5 years trying to undo your father's damage. Do not let Catherine force you back into his methods. Find a different path. He looked at her with something like awe. You really believe we can do this? I believe we have to try, because the alternative is surrender. And I did not fight this hard to surrender now. Caleb pulled her close. You are either the bravest woman I have ever met or the most stubborn. Both, definitely both. The next morning they went to Catherine's hotel. She received them in her suite, looking supremely confident. Have you come to accept my generous offer? No, Caleb said. We have come to tell you we will find our own markets. We do not need your railroad. Catherine laughed. Oh, Caleb, you are going to try the river route. Do you have any idea how many outfits have failed attempting that? The rapids alone will destroy you. Maybe, but it is our risk to take. Suit yourself. But when you come crawling back in 6 months broken, desperate, I will not be as generous. She dismissed them with a wave. In the hallway, Grace asked quietly, do you really think we can make the river route work? No idea. But I would rather fail trying than succeed by giving her what she wants. They left Denver the next day with their small caravan. The journey back to Winter Ridge felt different. They had won the legal battle. The inheritance was secure, but the real fight was just beginning. As they climbed into the mountains, Grace looked back at the city one last time. Somewhere down there, Catherine was plotting their destruction. Let her plot. Grace had faced poverty, death, legal battles, and public humiliation. She was still standing. Whatever came next, she would face it beside Caleb. Together they were stronger than Catherine could imagine, and together they would build something that lasted. The wagon crested the pass and Winter Ridge spread below them. Home, worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth everything. Grace smiled. Let Catherine have her railroads. They had something better. They had each other. 10 years passed like water flowing downstream. Grace stood on the porch of Winter House watching her children play in the meadow. William was 8 now, tall and serious like his father. Rose was 5, all energy and laughter. Baby Samuel toddled after his siblings on uncertain legs, determined to keep up. The valley had transformed. The river route had worked slowly and painfully at first, but worked. Winter Ridge timber was now known across the Western Territories as the finest sustainable lumber available. They had built partnerships with mills in California and Oregon. The business was smaller than Ambrose's empire had been, but it was stable and honest. The community had grown too. 40 families had become 60. The school taught 70 children. Grace's clinic was a real building now, with 2 young women she had trained as nurses. Emily had returned from Denver with a medical degree, working alongside her sister. Daniel managed the timber operation with Samuel, who had retired as foreman but stayed on as advisor. The workers owned shares in the company, now a cooperative model that had seemed radical in 1885, but was proving wildly successful. Catherine had not given up easily. She had tried to undercut their prices, spread rumors about quality, even attempted to buy their California contracts. But sustainable forestry had found its market. People would pay more for timber harvested ethically. Catherine's clear-cutting practices had become a liability as public opinion shifted. She had died the year before, bitter and alone. Her obituary called her a formidable businesswoman. Grace had read it and felt only sadness. What a waste of intelligence and drive, all channeled toward greed instead of good. Caleb came out onto the porch, moving slower than he used to. 48 now, gray, threading his dark hair. But his eyes were still sharp, still kind. He put his arms around Grace from behind, and they stood together watching their children. Martha sent a letter, Grace said. Thomas is getting married. She wants to know if we will come. Of course, he would not be walking down the aisle if not for you, or standing at all. Caleb kissed the top of her head. Do you ever regret it, any of it? Grace thought about the scared girl who had stood in a Pine Ridge cabin weighing an impossible choice, about the angry bride who had discovered her husband's deception, about the woman who had stood in a Denver courtroom and defended her right to be there. No, not a moment of it. Even the hard parts brought us here. To chaos and noise and children destroying the garden. Grace laughed. To family, to home, to us. That evening, after the children were asleep, Grace sat at her desk and found a letter waiting. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She opened it carefully. Dear Mrs. Winters, my name is Sarah Bright. I am a doctor's daughter from a small town in Wyoming. My father passed recently and left me with debts I cannot pay. I heard you might need an assistant at your clinic. I am skilled in medicine and willing to work hard. Please, if you have any position available, I would be grateful. Grace smiled, the pattern repeating. A desperate woman, a chance at salvation. She pulled out paper and began to write. Dear Sarah, yes, we have a position. Come to Winter Ridge, we will help. Because that was what you did. You extended the hand you wished someone had extended to you. You built the world you wanted to live in, one choice at a time. Grace sealed the letter and looked out at the valley dark under stars. Somewhere out there, a young woman waited for hope. Grace was sending it, just as someone had once sent it to her. The circle continued, and that was good. The summer sun of 1955 felt warm on old skin. Caleb sat in his chair on the porch, the same chair he had sat in for 40 years. 98 years old and still breathing, though each breath came harder than the last. Thomas sat beside him, young and uncertain. 20 years old with his whole life ahead, about to make choices that would define him. So you loved Grandma from the beginning, Thomas asked. Caleb smiled. I loved her before I knew what love was, before I deserved her. She taught me what it meant. The court case must have been terrifying. It was, but your grandmother stood up in that courtroom and fought for us, for what we were building. She was magnificent. Caleb's eyes grew distant. You know what I remember most? Not the verdict, not even Catherine's defeat. I remember Grace's testimony, when she told that whole courtroom that she would marry me again tomorrow, for nothing but me. That moment I knew we would be all right. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Grandpa, there is something I need to tell you. About the girl, Jenny. Thomas looked shocked. How did you know? I am old, not blind. You get the same look I had when I met your grandmother, scared and hopeful at once. My parents do not approve. They say she is just a teacher, that I should find someone more suitable. Caleb laughed, the sound harsh but genuine. Your grandmother was a country doctor's daughter with nothing but debts. Everyone said she was unsuitable, but she was perfect. She made me better than I had any right to be. So what do I do? Marry the woman who makes you want to be better, not the woman who looks good on your arm, not the woman your parents approve of, the one who will stand beside you when everything falls apart and fight to build it back up. Caleb pulled the silver ring from his pocket and the one that had lived there for 70 years. He pressed it into Thomas's hand. Give this to Jenny. Tell her it has been to hell and back, just like any good marriage. Thomas looked at the worn silver, at the faded engraving. I cannot take this. You can and you will, because that ring represents a choice. Your great-grandmother chose love over safety. She chose partnership over comfort. She chose to fight when running would have been easier. You need to make the same choice, boy. Do not let fear or propriety or other people's opinions choose your wife. You choose her. Thomas closed his hand around the ring. Thank you, Grandpa. That night, Caleb died peacefully in his sleep. Grace had been gone 5 years already, and he had been waiting to join her with the patience of a man who had learned to wait for good things. Thomas found him in the morning, hands folded on his chest, face peaceful, and clutched in one hand a photograph of Grace taken on their wedding day. Young and scared and beautiful and brave. The funeral drew 200 people. 4 generations of Winter Ridge community came to say goodbye to the man who had built something lasting. But it was Thomas's eulogy that captured it best. My great-grandfather taught me that love is not lightning. It is embers that grow through tending. He showed me that the best things in life require fighting for. And he proved that with the right partner, you can build something that outlasts you both. Thomas looked out at the valley, at the thriving community, at the healthy forest. This is his legacy, not money or land. This, people cared for, land stewarded, a vision of what business could be if you valued people over profit. A year later, Thomas married Jenny in the chapel at Winter Ridge. He wore the silver ring as his wedding band. She wore a simple dress, nothing fancy. But the vows they spoke were real and deep and meant. And when their children asked years later how they knew they were right for each other, Thomas told them about a scared mountain girl and a guilty timber baron who chose each other when the world said they should not, who fought for their marriage when it would have been easier to walk away, who built something beautiful from broken pieces. That is how you know, he would say. When you find someone worth fighting for, you fight. Everything else is just details. The valley listened and learned and grew, and the promise Caleb and Grace had made to each other echoed down through generations. Build something worth keeping. Love someone worth fighting for. Leave the world better than you found it. Simple truths. Hard won, forever lasting. And that Thomas told his grandchildren as he sat on the same porch in the same chair his great-grandfather had sat in was the real inheritance. Not land or money or timber rights, but the knowledge that you could choose love over fear, partnership over pride, and build something that mattered. The mountains listened and kept their secrets. The valley grew and prospered. And the promise lived on, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. This is the story Caleb told. This is the truth Grace lived. This is the legacy they left. And it was enough.